The land that would one day be called England did not yet know the meaning of nations, borders, or people. It existed in a state of pure being, sculpted only by the slow breath of ancient winds and the rise and fall of oceans that came long before memory. Imagine this place not as a country but as a shifting canvas, sometimes a tundra, sometimes a shallow sea, sometimes a dense forest of towering pines. There were no names for anything, because names require storytellers, and storytellers had not yet arrived. But the land already held its own silent language, spoken in stone, water, and time. 1,000,000 years ago, this region lay on the restless edge of prehistoric Europe. Continents shifted, climates oscillated, and entire worlds came and went in rhythms too slow for any creature to witness in a single lifetime. There were moments when the sea withdrew so far that vast plains stretched to the horizon, linking this land to places that today feel distant. At other times, colossal ice sheets crawled southward, grinding mountains into dust, carving valleys, erasing forests, and burying everything beneath a cold so absolute that even the idea of life seemed impossible. Yet life endured. It always does, even in places that appear timelessly still. Before humans, the landscape teemed with creatures that modern eyes might struggle to imagine. Early ancestors of elephants wandered through open grasslands, while enormous hippos wallowed in warm rivers during interglacial summers. Giant deer, with antlers like living crowns, drifted through forests that thrived where London or Birmingham would one day stand. The rhythm of nature unfolded without spectators, without chroniclers, only the eternal interplay of growth, decay, and renewal. This was a world ruled not by intention, but by instinct and ancient cycles. Rivers cut through the land in winding arcs, their courses shifting with each passing millennium. They carried stories of distant mountains, grinding boulders into pebbles, pebbles into sand, then sweeping them toward ancient coastlines. Where the rivers met the sea, broad wetlands formed, a mosaic of reeds, mudflats, and tidal pools shimmering under soft prehistoric sunlight. Birds circled above them, thousands of generations before any human eye would look up to wonder at their migrations. The land breathed instability and breathed out chaos, always changing, always returning to something new. Night in this ancient world brought a kind of darkness we can no longer experience. With no villages, no firelight, no distant glow from cities, the sky became a vast, overwhelming ocean of stars. The Milky Way hung like a river of white fire, undisturbed by anything except drifting clouds or falling snow. The moonlit silence was not empty, it was full, filled with the soft padding of predators on the hunt, the rustle of wind through prehistoric grasses, and the quiet pulse of a world unaware of the beings who would later try to claim it. Every shadow belonged to an animal. Every footprint belonged to a creature shaped entirely by nature. Over thousands of years, warmth would return, then fade, then return again. Forests would rise like green empires and fall like forgotten kingdoms. Coastlines would creep inward as seas rose, drowning lowlands that had once been alive with mammoths and grazing herds. Each transformation erased the marks of what came before, leaving the land perpetually young yet immeasurably old. It was a place always becoming, never finished, never settled. In those early ages, time did not move the way we understand it. A single shift in climate might take centuries. A species might flourish for hundreds of thousands of years before leaving behind nothing but a scattered fossil or a tooth embedded in ancient soil. Seasons came and went without stories to anchor them, without ritual, without memory. The land existed in a kind of quiet eternity, where change was constant but unnoticed. It was a world waiting, not consciously, but inevitably, for something new to arrive. And then, slowly, they came. Not yet the humans we know, not yet the storytellers, but wanderers, early hominins stepping cautiously across a landscape that would test them in every possible way. Their footprints would be among the first marks ever made by a creature capable of reflection, curiosity, and fear. But before they appeared, the land itself had shaped the stage on which their entire story would unfold. The rivers had made their paths. The forests had grown their shelters. The ice had carved their challenges. England, long before it bore that name, was preparing in silence. In the vast scale of deep time, the arrival of humans was only a flicker, yet it was a flicker destined to ignite a transformation unlike anything the land had ever seen. But before that light, there was only this, a world of shifting seas, roaring winds, sleeping giants, and landscapes that would become sacred grounds of future myths and memories. A world untouched, unclaimed, and unobserved. A world where time existed but had not yet learned to speak. The land remembered everything that happened in these early ages, even if no witnesses remained. And as the first wanderers approached, crossing plains that have since disappeared beneath the North Sea, the stage was set. The silence of 1,000,000 years was about to be broken, not by violence or catastrophe, but by presence. By footsteps. By eyes that could see meaning in the world. Before time had a name, England was already becoming the cradle of stories humanity had yet to tell. Around 900,000 to 800,000 years ago, the first known humans stepped into the land that would one day be called England. They were not modern humans, not even Neanderthals, but Homo antecessor, ancient wanderers whose entire existence was shaped by survival, instinct, and the restless curiosity that pushed them across continents. Their arrival was not a triumphant march but a cautious drift, following herds, rivers, and seasons until they reached the fringes of this mysterious northern world. To them, this land must have seemed both promising and terrifying, rich with life, yet harsh and unpredictable. These early humans had no maps, no plans, and no sense of borders. They simply moved where the environment allowed them to move. England at that time was not an island but a northern extension of Europe, connected by rolling plains and fertile valleys. The first wanderers likely crossed through open grasslands where mammoths grazed and giant deer stood like living monuments. They followed animal tracks, sheltered in caves near rivers, and approached each new landscape with the silent awareness of creatures who knew the world could change without warning. Their lives were delicate, suspended between opportunity and danger. What brought them here? Perhaps shifting climates pushed herds northward, and the humans followed. Perhaps some groups were forced out by competition, conflict, or dwindling resources. Or maybe, as some anthropologists suggest, early humans possessed a natural tendency to explore, to drift beyond familiar horizons simply because something inside them demanded it. Whatever the reason, their appearance in England marks the beginning of a long, complicated relationship between humans and this land, a relationship of adaptation, struggle, and transformation. Their tools were simple, hand axes made of flint or quartzite, shaped by striking stone against stone. Crude, yes, but powerful enough to butcher animals and break open bones for marrow. These tools were their lifeline, their answer to the megafauna that dominated the region. Against huge predators like saber-toothed cats or ancient lions, Homo antecessor were fragile, outmatched in strength but equipped with something far more important, a growing intelligence. Their survival depended on caution, cooperation, and an ability to read the land like a living map. The climate they encountered was unstable. England stood at the edge of fluctuating ice ages, where warm periods would bloom with forests and rivers, only to collapse into cold spells that turned the land barren and deadly. The first humans arrived during a rare warm phase, when life prospered. But even then, danger lurked everywhere, sudden storms, unpredictable seasons, and predators that moved silently through forests. These wanderers learned quickly that the land offered both shelter and threat, and that their survival depended on moving with the rhythms of nature rather than fighting against it. Imagine their camps, simple gatherings around fire, perhaps hidden under rock overhangs or in shallow caves. Fire was not merely warmth, it was safety, a circle of light that pushed back the night and the creatures that prowled within it. For the first time in England's history, flames danced against stone walls, casting shadows of human figures whose minds were beginning to imagine, remember, and plan. Their conversations, whatever form they took, were the earliest human thoughts ever spoken on this soil. Though their stay was not permanent, they would leave, return, vanish again. Their presence left traces that scientists now uncover: butchered animal bones, scattered tools, footprints preserved in ancient mudflats. These footprints, like the famous Haysborough prints in Norfolk, are among the oldest human footprints ever found outside Africa. They show a small group, including children, moving together across a river's edge nearly 1 million years ago. This single moment, frozen in time, reveals a truth more powerful than any fossil: the earliest people to walk England were families, not solitary hunters. They cared for each other. They moved together. They shared risks and decisions. Their story, however, is not one of permanence. The climate would shift once again, plunging England into cold so severe that humans could not survive. The first wanderers disappeared, leaving only fragments behind. But their brief presence set the stage for everything that would follow: the migrations of Neanderthals, the rise of modern humans, and the countless transformations of the landscape. They were the pioneers of deep prehistory, the first to test whether human life could cling to this northern frontier. Their arrival marks the beginning of the human journey in England, a journey of courage, adaptation, and silent resilience. They came with nothing but their bodies, their tools, and their will to exist. Yet they opened a story that would continue for 1 million years. In their fragile footsteps, left near ancient rivers, we find the first whispers of humanity in this land, footsteps that say, "We were here. We began something." Hundreds of thousands of years before the modern coastline formed, the region we now call England was not an island at all. Instead, it was part of a vast northern expanse of Europe, stitched to France, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia by immense plains and winding river systems. The English Channel did not yet exist, where waves now churn. Ancient rivers flowed lazily through valleys filled with grasses, willows, and herds of roaming animals. To early humans, this land was not separated or remote; it was simply another stretch of earth to cross, explore, and survive upon. The landscape was astonishingly open. In warm interglacial periods, broad grasslands spread across tens of thousands of square kilometers, dotted with wildflowers and shallow lakes that shimmered under the prehistoric sun. Herds of mammoths marched across these plains, carving paths through tall grasses. Giant deer lifted antlers wider than a human is tall. Woolly rhinos grazed near riverbanks, their heavy footsteps sinking into soft mud. Predators, saber-tooths, cave hyenas, ancient lions, roamed quietly, their shadows flickering across a land that seemed endless. In this world, early humans were just one species among many, moving cautiously within a sprawling ecosystem. The rivers were the true lifelines of this landscape. The ancient Thames, far wider and wilder than today, wound its way from what is now Germany through Doggerland, splitting into many channels before reaching the distant sea. Smaller rivers like the ancestral Solent and Beitham snaked through forests and marshes, carrying silt and stories across continents. These waterways provided humans with fish, fresh water, and pathways through the landscape. They also acted as natural borders, guiding migrations, shaping hunting grounds, and influencing where families chose to settle or pass through. Because England was not yet isolated by water, migrations of animals and humans were constant, flowing in both directions. Winter would push herds south, and with them came predators and human bands. Summer warmth invited life back north, triggering the return of grazing animals and the people who depended on them. This movement gave the land a pulse, one that beat slowly, in sync with the shifting climate. As ice sheets retreated, forests expanded. When ice advanced again, the land opened into sweeping tundras. England was not a fixed place but a breathing mosaic of environments. Imagine walking across this ancient plain. The horizon stretches far beyond anything modern eyes can witness in Britain. There are no cliffs dividing nations, no shorelines marking limits. Instead, the earth dips gently into valleys carved by meltwater and rises into rolling hills covered in coarse grass. To the early humans who ventured through it, the world must have felt infinite. There was no sense of crossing into England, only the experience of moving through a land of shifting climates and opportunities. The land bridges that connected England to Europe were not narrow passages but entire regions, hundreds of kilometers wide, full of life. During warm periods, these areas thrived as rich ecosystems, drawing both animals and humans. During colder phases, the same regions transformed into desolate tundras, sparsely populated by hardy species adapted to freezing winds. The changing landscape dictated everything: which plants grew, which animals survived, and whether humans could remain or were forced to retreat. Because these regions flourished and collapsed repeatedly over hundreds of millennia, humans arrived in waves rather than a continuous presence. One population would move in during a warm spell, leave behind tools and bones, then vanish when the climate turned harsh. Thousands of years later, another group might arrive, unaware that others had walked the same land long ago. England's prehistoric world was a corridor, sometimes open, sometimes blocked, always changing. The land itself decided when it was habitable. This constant transformation meant that early humans saw the world differently than we do. They would have noticed patterns invisible to us: how certain plants reappeared after warming periods, how rivers flooded or dried, how the behavior of animals changed with shifting seasons. To them, the land was a living entity, never still for long. It offered abundance, then scarcity, shelter, then danger. Travel was not a choice but a survival strategy, guided by the silent rules of deep nature. During particularly warm interglacials, dense forests spread across parts of southern England. Oak, pine, birch, and hazel filled the landscape, creating shaded corridors rich with berries, nuts, and smaller game. The air buzzed with insects, and the scent of damp earth followed every step. Yet only a few thousand years later, barely a blink in geological time, those forests might disappear under a sheet of ice. These extreme cycles shaped the instinctive behavior of early humans, giving rise to flexible, adaptive survival patterns. For now, however, in this era before England became an island, the world was one connected body of land. No ocean separated peoples or animals. Migration routes stretched far into the continent, allowing human groups to wander for generations without ever encountering a coastline. The modern idea of isolation did not exist; instead, the earth felt continuous, borderless, immense. This unity would not last. Gradually, the climate warmed again, glaciers melted, and the seas began to rise. Rivers swelled, marshlands expanded, and coastlines crept inland. What had once been a vast bridge slowly narrowed, then fragmented. But that moment lay far in the future. For now, England was open, an extension of the continent and a stage where early humans walked freely. They did not know the land would one day be surrounded by water. They only knew it as part of their world, a place where life moved in great, sweeping waves across an unbroken landscape. Long before England became a land of farms, villages, and quiet rolling hills, it was a kingdom ruled by giants. This was an age when humans were small, fragile figures moving carefully through a world dominated by enormous beasts whose presence shaped every choice, every step, and every breath. The landscapes of prehistoric England echoed not with the sounds of engines or cities, but with the heavy footfalls of megafauna, creatures so powerful and imposing that they made early humans seem almost insignificant. To survive here, one needed not only courage but an instinctive understanding of a wild, untamed world. Among the rulers of this age were the straight-tusked elephants, towering, magnificent animals that could weigh twice as much as modern African elephants. They moved through ancient forests like mobile mountains, pushing aside trees, creating pathways that humans often followed. Their presence signaled both danger and opportunity. From the remains they left behind, bones, tusks, and occasionally trapped carcasses, humans could gather materials for tools and meat for survival. But confronting a living straight-tusked elephant was not bravery, it was suicide. The early humans watched them from a distance, learning to read their patterns, respecting the invisible boundaries of the beast's domain. Then came the woolly rhinos, their massive bodies draped in thick fur and their horns curved like blades forged from keratin. These creatures were unpredictable, moving with surprising speed across open plains and tundra landscapes. A single charge could flatten a human or scatter an entire group of hunters. Yet these rhinos helped shape the land as they grazed and carved trails through Ice Age grasses. To early humans, they were reminders that survival required constant awareness. One wrong movement, one misstep, one rustle in the grass at the wrong moment, and the result could be fatal. But perhaps the most iconic of all were the giant deer, known scientifically as megaloceiros. Their antlers stretched upward like branches of living trees, spanning more than 3 meters across. Watching these deer walk through sunlit glades must have felt like witnessing a living myth. Their silent, graceful movements contrasted sharply with the violence that often exploded around them during rutting season, when males clashed with thunderous force. Early humans observed these creatures not only as a source of food but also as symbols, quiet guardians of the forests, embodying the beauty and brutality of nature. Predators, too, shaped the atmosphere of the Beast Age. Cave lions, larger than modern lions, stalked the grasslands in coordinated groups. Their roars could silence an entire valley. Saber-toothed cats moved through dense undergrowth with lethal elegance, their elongated canines shining like ivory daggers. To humans, these predators were more than threats, they were embodiments of darkness, fear, and the unpredictable nature of the wild. A single hunt gone wrong, a campfire too dim, or a child wandering too far from the group could draw the attention of these killers. Nighttime in this world was not merely darkness, it was a veil under which monsters roamed freely. Cave hyenas, powerful and ruthless, were among the most persistent dangers. Unlike lions or saber-tooths, hyenas hunted in large packs, capable of overwhelming even the strongest animals. They followed humans for days, waiting for exhaustion or desperation to create an opportunity. Their laughter echoed across plains, carrying both mockery and hunger. Early humans knew their calls well, and the sound of a hyena pack closing in could strike terror deep into the bones of any wandering family. The presence of these beasts transformed the way humans lived. Camps were chosen with calculation, elevated ground, defensible cliffs, narrow valleys where firelight could keep predators at bay. Hunting strategies revolved around avoiding competition with powerful carnivores. A fresh kill had to be salvaged quickly, before lions or hyenas smelled the blood. Even the timing of journeys shifted depending on when megafauna migrated or when predators were expected to lurk near water sources. Every action was a negotiation with a world that could crush humans without noticing. Yet this was also an age of profound awe. Imagine early humans watching mammoths appear on the horizon, massive, shaggy silhouettes emerging through fog, their tusks curving like ancient ivory sculptures. The earth trembled under their steps, and the air filled with the deep, resonant rumble of their calls. These moments must have stirred something powerful within human minds, a mixture of fear, wonder, humility, and perhaps even the first stirrings of spiritual thought. In a world filled with giants, humans learned that they were small, and that the land answered to no one. The Beast Age shaped the psychology of early humans. It taught them patience, caution, and unity. A single human stood no chance against a cave lion, but a group armed with stones, fire, and coordinated movements could sometimes drive predators away. This necessity for cooperation began to strengthen social bonds. Groups communicated more intricately, planned strategically, and relied deeply on one another. In many ways, the beasts forged humanity itself. They were the harsh teachers who forced humans to become smarter, more adaptable, and more interconnected. Tools evolved because of these creatures. Sharper hand axes, more efficient cutting tools, and early forms of spears emerged through the constant challenge of processing large carcasses or defending camps. Humans began to recognize the power of teamwork, not only in hunting but in scavenging. Often, early humans did not kill the megafauna themselves, they stole opportunities where possible. A lion abandoned a half-eaten rhinoceros, a mammoth fell through thin ice, or a stampede crushed a giant deer against a ravine wall. Scavenging required courage, speed, and the ability to sense when predators might return. This dance between danger and necessity defined the rhythm of daily life. Weather also magnified the drama of the Beast Age. England swung between warm, forested interglacials and bitter Ice Age winters. In warm phases, beasts multiplied, forests flourished, and prey became abundant. Humans followed this abundance with cautious optimism. But during colder phases, food grew scarce, predators became desperate, and the fragile balance between species fractured. Humans were pushed to the edge. Hunger sharpened instincts, storms shaped migrations, frozen rivers became deadly traps. The beasts suffered too, but unlike humans, they could not innovate. Those who failed to adapt vanished. Through these cycles of abundance and scarcity, life took on a mythic quality. Every encounter with a giant animal had the potential to become a defining moment for a human group. A mammoth sighting could mean salvation, food for weeks, or death. A lion's shadow could be a warning, a challenge, or a final omen. The land was alive not just with animals but with meaning. Early humans began to see patterns, create stories, form connections between events. The Beast Age wasn't just shaping bodies, it was shaping minds. Despite the danger, these giants were essential to the world's balance. They maintained open grasslands, spread seeds across huge distances, and carved pathways through dense vegetation. Without them, the land would have been unrecognizable. Humans learned to live not by conquering these beasts but by understanding them. They were competitors, yes, but also guides, creatures who revealed where water flowed, where forests ended, and where seasons shifted. In many ways, the Beast Age was the foundation of everything that came afterward. It established the dynamic between humans and nature, one of respect, caution, and constant negotiation. As millennia passed, some of these giant animals would disappear forever. But in their time, they shaped England into a place of immense drama, beauty, and challenge. They were the original rulers of the land, and early humans survived only by learning to walk in the shadows of giants. As the climate shifted and ice began its slow march southward, England transformed from a thriving, animal-rich landscape into a realm of biting winds, relentless snow, and unforgiving cold. For the early humans who lived through this change, survival became a daily negotiation with a world turning increasingly hostile. The warmth of the earlier interglacial periods faded, replaced by seasons that stretched with unbearable length. Winters were no longer mere passages of time, they were looming, dominant forces that shaped every decision, every movement, and every breath. In this harsh new era, fire became the most precious treasure a human group could possess. The cold did not announce itself in a single dramatic moment. It crept in gradually, year by year. First, summers grew shorter. Then, storms arrived sooner. Rivers froze earlier, and animals began their migrations weeks ahead of schedule. Grasslands hardened into brittle frost, and forests thinned as trees died under the weight of ice and wind. Early humans watched these changes with a kind of instinctive dread. They had no scientific understanding of climate shifts, but they felt the land withdrawing its generosity. What had once been a world of relative abundance became a place demanding relentless resilience. Fire was their defense against this creeping freeze. Its light pushed back the darkness that stretched endlessly across winter nights. Its warmth filled the hollow spaces between ribs and allowed the youngest and oldest members of a tribe to endure. But fire was not guaranteed. It required dry wood in a world where nearly everything was wet, snow-covered, or frozen solid. It required skill, flint knapping, spark catching, ember protecting. A single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. When fire was lost, groups sometimes traveled for days in search of another band willing to share their flames. Gathering fuel became a ritual of survival. Humans scavenged fallen branches buried beneath snow drifts, peeled bark from dying trees, and learned to store bundles of kindling inside shelters to keep them dry. The flames were never allowed to die completely. Even when groups migrated, they carried embers wrapped in animal skins, like sacred seeds of life. The glow of these embers could comfort those who feared the night, especially children who trembled in the darkness while winds howled through primitive shelters. Fire was the heart of the camp, the center around which life organized itself. The cold also changed the animals. Many migrated south, leaving behind only the hardiest species: reindeer, woolly mammoths, musk oxen. These creatures adapted with thick coats and behaviors that helped them navigate the icy plains. Humans, lacking such natural defenses, had to rely on clothing made from hides, woven grasses, or furs. They shaped bone needles and tied sinew threads, crafting garments that wrapped their bodies in layers of warmth. The evolution of clothing was not a luxury but a necessity, one that allowed them to push deeper into freezing territories. At night, fires cast long shadows on cave walls, transforming rough stone into a dreamlike landscape. The early humans gathered close, sharing stories, not in the way we understand stories, but in gestures, murmurs, and the ancient languages of expression. The crackling flames illuminated faces marked by cold, hunger, and determination. These nights forged bonds between members of the group. They learned to trust one another, to protect one another, to share food when scarcity pressed in. Community became essential because no one could survive the cold alone. The landscape itself took on a new personality. What had once been soft rivers and green valleys became frozen corridors. Snow-covered plains stretched outward like endless white deserts, their silence broken only by the crunch of human footsteps. The sky grew pale and empty, often concealed by thick clouds that refused to let the sun shine through. Even in daylight, the light was dim and muted, as though the world had retreated into itself. Humans had to navigate this altered terrain with sharp memory and intuition, remembering where shelters existed, where animals might pass, where frozen lakes could be crossed safely. Food was the constant challenge. Hunting became harder as animals grew scarce. Humans learned to track more carefully, follow faint footprints through snow, and observe patterns of movement across the frozen land. They used fire to harden spear tips, making their weapons more durable. They roasted meat not only for taste but to preserve it, discovering early forms of food storage that could save them during the most brutal stretches of winter. The cooperation required to hunt large animals in freezing conditions strengthened social coordination. Every successful hunt was a victory of strategy and unity, celebrated with gratitude around the fire. Yet the cold was not only an enemy. It was also a teacher. It forged innovation. It pushed humans to create better shelters, caves reinforced with branches and hides, snow-packed walls that insulated against wind, circular huts made from mammoth bones. They learned to choose land wisely, selecting areas shielded by hills or forests where wind lost its strength. They learned that moving at the wrong time could be deadly, that storms could trap them for days, and that safety sometimes meant staying in one place longer than they wished. Emotionally, the cold carved deep marks. Fear became a constant companion, but so did wonder. The world took on a quiet beauty under snow. Moonlight reflected on ice, turning the night into a glowing landscape. The glowing horizon at dawn, pale and fragile, reminded humans that warmth still existed somewhere. Families huddled together beneath furs, sharing stories, comfort, and warmth. In these moments, fire was not merely a tool, it was a symbol of life persisting against impossible odds. Sometimes, the cold won. Groups vanished during severe winters, leaving behind scattered tools or footprints that led nowhere. These losses were not unusual in prehistory, but each one shaped the memory of those who survived. They learned to read the land more carefully. They passed down knowledge of safe routes, seasonal patterns, and fire-making techniques. Over generations, cold-hard survival became part of human identity. Firelight against the cold marks the era when humans discovered their most powerful ally, not strength, not speed, but knowledge. Fire taught them that they could challenge the world's harshest forces. It gave them control over darkness, warmth in freezing wilderness, and a reason to gather, communicate, and dream. In the glow of those ancient flames, humanity learned what it meant to endure. For hundreds of thousands of years, long before modern humans walked the forests and valleys of England, Neanderthals were its true inhabitants. They were not brutish cavemen as once portrayed, but deeply intelligent and emotionally complex beings who understood this land in ways few species ever have. Their connection to the wild was intimate, born of generations surviving its storms, hunting its giant animals, and reading its subtle signs. In England's deep prehistory, Neanderthals were the masters, adapted, resilient, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature. Their bodies were built for the cold world they inhabited. Shorter and sturdier than modern humans, with powerful limbs and barrel-shaped chests, they were living expressions of survival. Their bones show a life shaped by strength and endurance. Whether they moved through icy tundras or dense woodlands, their heavy musculature gave them stability in the harshest conditions. Their hands were strong, capable of gripping tools with precision, and their senses were sharp, keen enough to detect changes in the wind, the movement of distant herds, or the presence of predators long before they appeared. In this rugged landscape, the Neanderthal body was an evolutionary masterpiece. But their physical strength was matched by their intelligence. Recent discoveries reveal that Neanderthals made sophisticated tools, crafted with intention and skill. They shaped flint into finely detailed scrapers, knives, spearheads, and cutting blades. These tools were not made in haste, they were planned, designed, and produced through a deep understanding of stone and its properties. The famous Mysterian tool culture, often associated with Neanderthals, shows a level of craftsmanship that reflects intellect, patience, and innovation. For Neanderthals, technology was not primitive, it was essential, refined, and passed down through generations. Their hunting strategies were equally impressive. Neanderthals often hunted large, dangerous animals such as woolly rhinos, giant deer, and even mammoths. To take down such beasts required cooperation, courage, and tactical planning. They used thrusting spears, likely approaching their prey at close range, a dangerous method that demanded absolute unity within the group. Injured skeletons reveal broken bones that later healed, suggesting that Neanderthals cared for their wounded. No individual was abandoned because of weakness. Survival depended not on the strongest but on the group's willingness to support each other. Their shelters, though simple, were crafted with care. They sought out caves, riverbanks, and natural formations that provided warmth and protection. Inside these shelters, firelight reflected off stone walls just as it had for the earlier hominins, but for Neanderthals, fire was more than warmth. It was a gathering point for storytelling, toolmaking, and emotional bonding. They used fire to cook meat, making food easier to digest and safer to consume. The aroma of roasted meat would have filled their caves, mixing with the earthy scent of fur and smoke. For Neanderthals, firelight was a symbol of home. What truly distinguished Neanderthals, however, was their emotional depth. Evidence shows they cared for their elderly and buried their dead, acts that suggest a sense of compassion and ritual. Some burials even contain flowers or tools placed intentionally beside the deceased. These gestures hint at something profound, an awareness of life and death, and perhaps a belief in meaning beyond the physical world. The Neanderthals' emotional world may have been rich with intuition, symbolism, and bonds forged through shared struggle. They were not simply surviving, they were living with a sense of community and continuity. England during the Neanderthal age shifted between cold and warm periods, and the Neanderthals adapted to every change. When glaciers advanced, they followed herds into open tundras, wrapping themselves in thick hides and moving in tight groups across the frozen landscape. When the world warmed, they returned to forests, rivers, and fertile valleys, hunting red deer and boar while gathering roots, berries, and edible plants. Their seasonal migrations were not chaotic, they followed patterns observed over countless generations. They understood the land intimately, from the behavior of migrating herds to the hidden locations of flint deposits. Their daily lives were filled with subtle rituals, repairing tools, tanning hides, sharpening stone blades, teaching children how to track animals or shape flint. Young Neanderthals learned by observing elders, imitating their movements, and gradually developing their own skills. The bond between generations ensured that knowledge never faded. Their communities were small but tightly interconnected, united by shared labor and mutual reliance. In the soft glow of firelight, children listened to the stories of the land told in gestures, vocalizations, and unspoken traditions that shaped their understanding of the world. Art, too, may have been part of their lives. Though rare, engravings and carved patterns associated with Neanderthals suggest they had an aesthetic sense, a desire to mark, decorate, or symbolically express themselves. Perhaps their art was subtle, hidden in carved bones, decorated tools, or pigments used on the body or on hides. These expressions remind us that Neanderthals were not emotionless survivors, they were creative beings capable of imagination and beauty. Despite their deep mastery of the land, Neanderthals faced constant challenges. Climate change pushed them back and forth across territory. Competition with lions and hyenas forced them to defend carcasses or abandon valuable kills. Injuries were common, and harsh winters tested their limits. They were powerful, but not invincible. Yet their resilience kept them in England far longer than any other early human species. They returned repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years, enduring cycles of ice and warmth that would have defeated many other species. To modern humans, Neanderthals might seem distant, but their story is deeply human. They loved, feared, cared, hunted, gathered, and dreamed. They stood against the cold winds of prehistory and carved a life within a world most of us could not survive for a single day. They shaped England long before our species did, leaving behind tools, bones, and memories etched into the landscape. In this era, Neanderthals were not just inhabitants, they were the keepers of the wild. They understood its language, respected its forces, and thrived within its endless challenges. Their legacy is not merely a fossil record but a testament to the strength and richness of a species that lived in harmony with the land, shaping it as much as it shaped them. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals moved through the forests, valleys, and frozen plains of England with a quiet mastery that no other human species had achieved. Yet despite their strength and deep-rooted connection to the land, there came a period when their presence began to fade. It did not happen in a single moment. There was no dramatic eruption, no sudden catastrophe. Instead, the Neanderthals disappeared in a long, almost silent withdrawal, a vanishing so gradual that, at the time, no one would have understood it was happening. But the land noticed. The forests felt the absence of their footsteps. The caves lost the comforting glow of their firelight. And England entered one of the most mysterious chapters in its prehistoric story. The causes of their decline remain one of archaeology's most debated puzzles. Climate change, competition, isolation, and shifting environments all played roles. As the Ice Age pushed forward again, temperatures plummeted. England became unstable, sometimes a warm refuge, sometimes a frozen wasteland. Each cycle forced Neanderthal groups to move, adapt, or retreat. These migrations were not easy, the landscape changed faster than their populations could recover. Valleys they once hunted and flooded or froze, forests died off, and animals they depended on shifted their migration routes. The environment they had mastered for hundreds of generations was becoming unrecognizable. Climate stress alone, however, does not explain everything. Modern humans had begun expanding into Europe, bringing with them new tools, different hunting strategies, and larger social networks. They were more adaptable to fluctuating environments, and their groups tended to be larger and more interconnected. Where Neanderthals lived in smaller, more isolated communities, Homo sapiens formed vast webs of communication that allowed ideas, resources, and survival strategies to spread rapidly. This difference in connectivity may have given sapiens an advantage during periods of crisis. For the Neanderthals, isolation could be deadly. Encounters between Neanderthals and modern humans almost certainly occurred, especially in regions connected by land bridges. These meetings were likely a mixture of conflict, avoidance, cooperation, and even interbreeding. Genetic evidence shows that the two species blended at times, leaving traces of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans today. Yet blending did not prevent decline. If anything, it hints at a more complex interaction, one where Neanderthal populations may have gradually been absorbed into larger human groups, losing their distinct identity over generations. But decline is rarely caused by one factor alone. As the world grew colder, resources shrank. With fewer animals to hunt, Neanderthal groups struggled to sustain themselves. Injuries, always common in their close-range hunting style, became more dangerous when food was scarce. Children faced harsher conditions, and many never reached adulthood. Slowly, the balance that had sustained Neanderthal life began to break. Even slight population drops, just a few families per generation, could snowball into irreversible decline. Their social structure, once their strength, may have become a vulnerability. Neanderthals lived in small groups that were deeply bonded, but when a group dwindled, there were few neighboring communities to merge with. This isolation meant that sickness, starvation, or environmental disaster could wipe out an entire family line. Modern humans, by contrast, could merge, expand, and integrate into larger communities. Neanderthal populations became like scattered beads on a string. Once they broke apart, they could not reconnect. The emotional dimension of this disappearance is difficult to imagine, yet it must have been profound. Families accustomed to a certain rhythm of life suddenly faced empty forests, changing seasons, and dwindling herds. The wisdom passed down through generations, where to hunt, where to find shelter, when to migrate, began to lose its relevance. The land was no longer responding in familiar ways. What does a community feel when its understanding of the world stops working? What does a parent feel when they sense that their children may not inherit a future? Their decline was not just physical but cultural, a slow unraveling of a way of life. Archaeological evidence shows that in their final centuries, Neanderthal presence in England became sporadic. There are long stretches of time where no tools, no bones, no traces appear. It is as though they attempted to return after harsh periods but could no longer maintain a lasting foothold. England, which they had once understood so well, was slipping away from them. Eventually, the land became empty of their voices. Fires went out in caves that had sheltered generations. Valleys that had echoed with their hunts fell silent. This disappearance creates a haunting sense of absence. The Neanderthals did not leave monuments or written records. Their final moments were not recorded in any tale. No one witnessed the last Neanderthal child walking through an English valley, or the last hunt, or the final fire that flickered out against a cave wall. Their exit from England, and later from the world, felt like a breath fading in a storm, unnoticed but deeply significant. Yet they did not vanish entirely. Their DNA persists in us, a quiet reminder that they are part of our story. The memory of their craftsmanship, their intelligence, their endurance remains etched in the stones they shaped and the landscapes they once dominated. The land of England still carries the imprint of their footsteps, buried in sediments, waiting for archaeologists to uncover hints of the lives they led. The story of their vanishing forces us to confront the fragility of even the strongest species, the way nature can shift so rapidly that mastery becomes vulnerability. The Great Vanishing stands as a moment of profound melancholy in prehistoric history. It marks the end of an era where Neanderthals were the keepers of the wild, a role they held for longer than modern humans have even existed. Their disappearance was not failure, it was the result of a world in relentless motion, changing faster than ancient traditions could adapt. Their legacy is not defined by extinction but by endurance, by the tens of thousands of years they thrived in the face of unimaginable challenges. As their presence faded, the stage was quietly set for the arrival of a new kind of human. A species that would walk the same valleys but bring a different way of thinking, storytelling, and shaping the land. The Neanderthals may have vanished, but their story is the foundation upon which the next chapter of England's prehistoric journey would be built. Around 40,000 years ago, a new kind of human stepped into the ancient landscapes of England, a species with a mind wired for innovation, imagination, and adaptation. These were Homo sapiens, our ancestors, carrying not only tools and fire but something far more transformative, symbolic thought. Their arrival was not an invasion but a slow unfolding, a series of small groups drifting northward from mainland Europe during warmer intervals. They followed rivers, coastlines, and migrating herds, eventually crossing into a land that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species before them. Where Neanderthals once walked as the masters of survival, modern humans arrived as the architects of change. The first sapiens entering England encountered a landscape fragile from the cold but rich enough to sustain life. The climate hovered on the edge of instability, cold winds sweeping across plains, forests expanding and contracting with each passing century, and animals migrating unpredictably. Yet these newcomers possessed a remarkable advantage: they could imagine possibilities beyond their immediate challenges. They carried memories of places far away and strategies refined by vast interconnected networks of human groups. Every member of a sapiens band was part of a large, expanding web of ideas stretching across continents. Their tools reflected this intelligence. Unlike the thrusting spears of Neanderthals, modern humans developed projectile weapons such as spear throwers, tools that allowed them to strike from a distance, reducing the risk of injury during hunts. They crafted blades of breathtaking precision, thin and sharp like flakes of moonlight. They shaped bone and antler into barbed points, harpoons, needles, and ornaments. Each tool showed not only practical purpose but also aesthetic sensitivity. Even utilitarian objects carried elegance in their curves, symmetry, and polish. These tools did more than help them survive, they signaled creativity, identity, and social belonging. Art accompanied them as well. Early humans painted on walls, carved shapes into bone, and created figurines representing animals, spirits, and ancestors. Though England's damp climate destroyed most organic materials, some fragments reveal glimpses of symbolic life: engraved patterns, decorated tools, pigments used for body paint or ritual. This new artistic consciousness changed the landscape. Where Neanderthals saw the world in terms of survival and familiarity, sapiens saw meaning, metaphor, and story. A valley was not just a valley, it could be a sacred path, a home of ancestral spirits, a place where dreams crossed into reality. Their social structures were more expansive too. Groups were larger, more diverse, and more fluid. Families could merge with others, creating alliances that stretched beyond immediate kinship. These networks allowed information, techniques, and resources to travel great distances. A hunting strategy perfected in one region might be shared with people hundreds of kilometers away. This exchange of knowledge strengthened sapiens' resilience during climatic shifts. When the world changed, sapiens changed with it, quickly, creatively, and collectively. Upon entering England, sapiens encountered the remnants of Neanderthal presence. Perhaps they found abandoned shelters, broken tools, and footprints fading into ancient mud. Some interactions between the two species may have been peaceful, involving quiet coexistence or brief exchanges of resources. Others may have involved competition over hunting grounds or shelter. But by the time sapiens established a foothold in England, Neanderthals had already been fading. Modern humans did not erase them, they stepped into a world already loosening its grip on the species that once ruled it. The arrival of sapiens transformed the rhythm of life across the land. They hunted with precision, targeting specific animals according to season and migration patterns. Reindeer herds, mammoths, wild horses, and even fish became integrated into their diet. They used fire to shape their surroundings, clearing small patches to encourage plant growth or manipulate herd movements. Their shelters ranged from caves adorned with paintings to tent-like structures built from hides, bones, and wooden poles. These homes could be dismantled, carried, and rebuilt, evidence of extraordinary mobility. The emotional and spiritual life of sapiens also brought a new depth to the landscape. They may have performed rituals during hunts, sung songs around fires, or left offerings at significant landmarks. Their relationship with death was especially symbolic. Burial sites from this era often show careful placement of bodies, accompanied by tools, ochre pigment, or ornaments. These gestures hint at beliefs about an afterlife, memory, or connection to ancestors. For the first time in England, the land became not just a place to survive but a place to belong, a space woven with meaning, identity, and sacred purpose. Children played a crucial role in this transformation. Young sapiens learned rapidly, absorbing knowledge not only from parents but from a wide network of adults. They practiced toolmaking with small flakes of stone, mimicked hunting movements with sticks, and listened to stories told in complex language. This shared cultural learning allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations, speeding up innovation. Where Neanderthal knowledge tended to remain stable over long periods, sapiens' culture evolved quickly, building upon each new discovery. But their journey in England was not without hardship. The climate continued to shift unpredictably. Harsh winters forced migrations, sudden thaws flooded valleys, and scarce resources tested their unity. Yet sapiens endured, adapting strategies, altering tools, and expanding social bonds. Their flexibility allowed them to survive in environments that many species, including their Neanderthal cousins, could not. They were dreamers, but also strategists. They saw possibilities in the land that earlier humans had never imagined. As sapiens spread across England, they began shaping its future. Their fires lit up dark valleys. Their footsteps created pathways that animals later followed. Their stories echoed in caves and along riversides. With every generation, their imprint on the land grew deeper. They were not simply crossing into England, they were beginning a new chapter of human existence. Homo sapiens crossed the threshold marks the moment when imagination became a force of survival. When creativity joined hands with adaptation. When humans began to transform not only themselves but the land beneath their feet. Through their arrival, England stepped into a new age, one shaped by minds capable of dreaming worlds into being. As the last glacial maximum approached, England became a land caught between two worlds, one shaped by encroaching ice, the other clinging to fleeting warmth. Climate during this era swung with violent unpredictability. One generation might know forests alive with red deer and birdsong, while the next grew up in a barren tundra swept by unrelenting winds. For the early Homo sapiens living here, the land felt unstable, as though it shifted its identity every few centuries. They were forced to navigate a landscape where seasons stretched unpredictably, rivers froze and thawed without warning, and survival depended on reading signs that changed as fast as the weather itself. The cold descended slowly at first, signaled by longer winters, thinning forests, and the return of species adapted to severe climates. Reindeer herds expanded, woolly mammoths drifted southward, and the grasses of the plains grew brittle under frost. But soon the cold intensified, reshaping England into a near-Arctic world. Ice sheets advanced from the north like enormous, grinding machines, carving valleys, crushing forests, and stripping soil from hillsides. The air grew sharper, the winds harsher. Snow piled upon snow until the land seemed buried beneath a white silence, broken only by migrating herds and the soft crunch of human footsteps. In these conditions, England became nearly uninhabitable. Human groups retreated southward in waves, driven not by choice but by necessity. Some crossed back into mainland Europe as rivers froze, turning travel into dangerous but possible crossings. Others followed animal herds, tracing their movements along icy plains in search of food. Camps grew temporary and quick to dismantle. Fire became more than warmth, it became a strategy. Groups learned to preserve embers across long journeys, carrying them inside bark containers or wrapped in hides. Those precious sparks were the difference between life and death on nights when temperatures plunged without mercy. Yet even in the midst of this cold, moments of warmth punctured the glacial grip. Interstadial periods, brief pockets of milder climate, allowed forests to creep back, lakes to form, and animals to multiply. For a few generations, England would become habitable again. Humans ventured northward, returning to familiar valleys, rediscovering caves where ancestors had once lit fires. They hunted red deer, gathered plants, and celebrated the return of abundance. But in these hopeful moments, the land played a careful trick. Warmth never lasted. A sudden shift in ocean currents or wind patterns could plunge the region back into freezing cold almost overnight. What had seemed like stability was only a fragile illusion. These cycles created a world of constant movement. Humans migrated like the animals they hunted, following unpredictable routes shaped by shifting climates. They learned to map the land in terms of opportunity rather than permanence. A river that flowed in childhood might dry up by adulthood. A forest that once offered shelter could be buried under snow within a lifetime. This instability forced early humans to become experts in adaptation. They read the sky, listened to winds, tracked the migrations of birds, and interpreted subtle changes in animal behavior. The environment became a teacher, harsh but invaluable. Emotionally, this era left deep marks. Every campfire may have felt like a fragile claim against the immense forces of nature. Families crouched together in shelters made of hides and bones, listening to winds howl like ancient spirits. Nights grew long, so long that time itself seemed stretched thin. In the darkness, fears magnified, fear of starvation, fear of predators, fear of the unknown future. But these fears also forged unity. Groups grew tighter, bonds stronger. Shared hardship shaped early cultural identity. Survival was no longer an individual struggle, it was a collective one, woven into the fabric of their stories and rituals. The glacial era also changed the animals that lived alongside humans. Giant deer vanished from some regions, replaced by smaller species more suited to cold. Mammoths became more common on the open plains, their movements influencing human migrations. Predators adapted too, hyenas retreated, wolves spread, and cave lions persisted in scattered pockets. Each shift in the ecosystem forced humans to reevaluate their strategies. The land offered life, but only to those who could decode its ever-changing language. As ice expanded, the geography itself transformed dramatically. Sea levels dropped, exposing vast landscapes that connected England to continental Europe. What would later become the North Sea was at times a wide, frozen tundra or a network of rivers and lakes. Humans could walk from what is now Norfolk to the Netherlands without ever seeing an ocean. The world felt enormous yet connected, open yet dangerous. This new land became a migration corridor for both humans and animals, shaping the story of England in ways that would echo for thousands of years. But as the cold reached its maximum intensity, England ultimately became too hostile for sustained human life. The land emptied. Human presence faded once more, leaving behind only scattered tools and footprints buried beneath layers of permafrost. For centuries, perhaps millennia, England was a frozen wilderness, watched only by winds and wandering mammoths. It seemed that human life had been pushed out permanently. Then, slowly, the ice receded again. The world warmed. Rivers flowed. Forests returned. And with the retreat of the ice came opportunity, a chance for humans to return and reshape the land once more. In this era of extremes, England became a crossroads of ice and fire, caught between freezing ages and fleeting warmth, between abandonment and renewed hope. For Homo sapiens, it was both a trial and a transformation. The lessons learned in this unstable world, adaptability, cooperation, innovation, would define their future and prepare them for the monumental changes yet to come. In the world that emerged after the great ice sheets began to melt, England was not an island but the western edge of a vast, sprawling landscape known today as Doggerland. This enormous territory stretched from the eastern coasts of Britain all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands, forming a lush landmass filled with rivers, forests, lakes, and wetlands. It was the true heart of prehistoric Britain, a bridge that connected human communities across thousands of kilometers. To the people who lived there, it was not a mysterious lost world. It was home, familiar, fertile, and full of life. During the early Holocene, Doggerland flourished as one of the richest environments in northern Europe. Great rivers threaded through its plains, weaving between rolling hills and deep marshes. These rivers carried salmon and freshwater fish, attracting predators such as otters and early brown bears. The land was dotted with lakes large and small, their surfaces shimmering under gentle sunlight. Around them grew hazel, oak, birch, and pine, forming forests alive with birdsong and the rustling of animals. Herds of red deer, aurochs, wild boar, and horses wandered across open meadows, while elk moved gracefully through the wetter lowlands. For humans, this abundance made Doggerland a paradise. Hunter-gatherer communities established camps along riverbanks, hilltops, and sheltered valleys. Here, families cooked fish, roasted meat, and gathered berries and nuts in seasonal cycles. They built temporary shelters from wood, animal skins, and reeds, often returning to the same spots year after year as resources renewed themselves. The land's richness allowed populations to grow. People could travel long distances along waterways, carrying stories, tools, and knowledge between groups. Doggerland acted as a cultural crossroads, where ideas blended and innovation spread across regions, an unseen network of human connection thriving beneath the prehistoric sky. The land itself shaped their lives. Wetlands provided reeds for weaving mats and baskets, while forests supplied timber for tools and spears. Lakes offered fish year-round, reducing the seasonal pressures that earlier humans had faced. On the open plains, hunters targeted red deer or wild cattle, using sophisticated techniques developed over generations. Children learned to track animals by studying footprints in mud, observing broken twigs, or listening to calls carried through the trees. Every part of Doggerland provided something essential, nothing was wasted, nothing overlooked. It was a world built on balance, between human need and natural abundance. Yet beneath this calm surface, the world was changing. The melting of the great northern ice sheets sent millions of gallons of water cascading into the oceans. Sea levels rose slowly at first, meters over centuries, then faster as the warming accelerated. Marshes expanded, rivers shifted course, and low-lying valleys flooded. For a while, these changes were manageable. Communities simply moved camps uphill or followed animals to new grazing areas. The transformation happened across many generations, slow enough to be noticed but not alarming. But as the centuries passed, the sea continued its steady advance, claiming more of the land each year, turning once fertile plains into shallow bays. Humans adapted, but the pressure grew. Regions that had been rich hunting grounds became treacherous marshes. Forests disappeared beneath encroaching saltwater. The coastline began to fracture into islands. Fishermen returned with stories of once familiar places now submerged. Families who had lived in the same place for generations were forced to relocate, carrying with them memories of areas that would soon vanish forever. Migration became a necessity, not across empty land, but away from the rising sea that swallowed their world piece by piece. The drowning of Doggerland was not a single event but a long, sorrowful retreat. People adapted as best they could. Some shifted north toward what would become Britain. Others moved south or east into Europe. The land bridge that had connected continents narrowed to a vulnerable strip. Storms became more frequent as climate continued to warm, sending powerful surges of water into low valleys. Each storm took more land, more trees, more settlements. It must have felt like the world was losing pieces of itself, fragments slipping away into the depths. Then came the moment that sealed Doggerland's fate. Around 8,200 years ago, a catastrophic event known as the Storegga Slide, a massive undersea landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered enormous tsunami waves that swept across the North Sea. The waves crashed into Doggerland with devastating force, flooding vast areas in hours. Marshes, forests, and coastal camps were obliterated. People who had already been pushed to higher ground now faced a catastrophe beyond imagination. Though Doggerland had been shrinking for millennia, this tsunami helped accelerate its final fragmentation. In the aftermath, the sea continued to rise, swallowing what remained until the entire region lay beneath the waves. The loss of Doggerland reshaped human history. It marked the final separation of England from mainland Europe, turning the region into an island. It also transformed human culture. Communities that once roamed wide landscapes adjusted to smaller territories. Coastal living became more important. Fishing and boat building evolved rapidly as the sea took on a central role in daily life. The memory of Doggerland likely persisted in stories, tales of lands that once existed, sinking under rising waters, consumed by the ocean's hunger. Today, Doggerland lies hidden beneath the North Sea, preserved in layers of sediment. Archaeologists uncover fragments of its past, flint tools, animal bones, ancient tree stumps, even traces of human settlements, revealing glimpses of a world once teeming with life. These discoveries remind us that Doggerland was not a myth but a living world, fully inhabited and deeply loved by the people who called it home. In the story of England's prehistory, Doggerland stands as a symbol of both abundance and loss. It was one of the most fertile regions humans ever settled, a cradle of culture and movement. But it was also a reminder of nature's power, how seas can rise, worlds can disappear, and entire landscapes can vanish without leaving a trace on the surface. For the people of its time, the drowning of Doggerland would have felt like the end of an era. For us, it marks one of the most dramatic transformations in the ancient history of Britain, a moment when a continent breathed its last and an island was born. As the ice sheets continued their long retreat and the climate warmed, England transformed from a frozen frontier into a flourishing landscape rich with life. Rivers once locked beneath ice surged forward in powerful currents, carving new paths through the softening earth. Valleys filled with meltwater, forming lakes that reflected brilliant skies. Where tundra had stretched endlessly, forests now began to rise, first sparse and hesitant, then dense and vibrant. The land breathed again, as though awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. For the humans returning to this reborn world, it must have felt like stepping into a paradise shaped by both memory and miracle. The earliest forests consisted of pioneering species, birch, hazel, willow, trees that could grow in thin soils and withstand unpredictable climates. Their roots spread across hillsides, holding the newly thawed ground in place. With time, these gave way to oaks, elms, and pines, creating dense woodland canopies that filtered sunlight into shifting mosaics on the forest floor. Moss covered old stones. Ferns unfurled in soft green waves. Wildflowers carpeted clearings in bursts of color. England was becoming one of Europe's great post-glacial woodlands, a realm defined by growth, renewal, and the slow return of ecological harmony. Animals responded quickly to this transformation. Red deer roamed among the trees, nibbling on young shoots. Aurochs, massive wild cattle, wandered through open meadows, their deep bellows echoing across valleys. Wild boar rooted through undergrowth in search of food, shaping the forest structure as they moved. Beavers returned to rivers, building dams that altered the flow of streams and created new wetlands. Birds migrated back in enormous flocks, filling the air with movement and sound. The land pulsed with life in every direction, rebounding with astonishing speed after thousands of years of hardship. For humans, this new world offered opportunity unlike anything their ancestors had seen during the harsh ages of ice. Hunter-gatherer groups spread across Britain, following rivers into the heart of the forest. They settled beside lakes where fish were plentiful and built seasonal camps along riverbanks where resources were abundant. The warmth allowed them to travel farther with less risk. Food became more varied: nuts, berries, fish, game, edible plants, and the availability of these resources shaped the rhythm of life. Instead of chasing herds across freezing plains, humans now lived in sync with the cycles of the forest. The forests also provided raw materials for tools, weapons, and shelter. Humans crafted bows and arrows from flexible wood, revolutionizing hunting. Spears were tipped with microliths, tiny, razor-sharp stone blades. Nets, baskets, and fish traps made from woven plant fibers allowed people to harvest resources in ways that had been impossible during the icy past. Clothing was fashioned from tanned hides, sewn with bone needles and sinew threads. Shelters became more elaborate, using wooden frames covered with hides, bark, or woven mats. A more stable world allowed for more creativity and craftsmanship. Spiritually and emotionally, the rebirth of the land influenced how humans understood their world. The return of sunlight, warmth, and abundant life stirred feelings of gratitude and reverence. Forest clearings became natural gathering places where families celebrated the changing seasons. Lakes and rivers took on symbolic meaning, perhaps seen as gifts from ancient spirits or ancestors. The sounds of birds and animals created a natural soundtrack that shaped early storytelling, myths, and rituals. The world no longer felt like a harsh enemy. It felt like a companion, a living presence that offered shelter and sustenance. But this rebirth also brought new challenges. Dense forests made hunting more complicated, forcing humans to develop stealth, strategy, and cooperation. Predators like wolves and bears flourished in the new woodlands, making encounters more dangerous. Floods became common as melting ice fed rivers beyond their banks. Mosquitoes and other insects thrived in wetlands, spreading discomfort and disease. Though life was abundant, survival still required careful knowledge of the land's shifting moods. Human movement through the landscape created trails that animals began to follow. Campsites left behind traces: shells from river mussels, charcoal from fires, tools lost during daily activities. These remnants tell a story of a people deeply connected to their environment. They returned to the same places year after year, building a sense of tradition and continuity. Children grew up learning where the best fishing spots were, where deer tended to gather, and which plants were safe to eat. In this new world, knowledge was as valuable as any tool. What makes this era so unique is its sense of peace. While earlier periods were defined by extremes, ice, hunger, flight, this time allowed humans to settle into a rhythm with the land. They were no longer pushed by relentless cold or forced into constant migration. Instead, they could explore, experiment, and adapt at a slower, more human pace. The natural world became a teacher rather than a threat. Every season revealed new patterns, offering lessons in growth, decay, and renewal. The rebirth of England shaped the foundations of future culture. Everything that would come later, agriculture, community life, ritual, trade, would be built on the stability found in this era. It was a world reborn not only in ecological terms but also in human experience. The land that had once seemed brutal and unforgiving now invited humans to thrive, dream, and imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. The world reborn represents a turning point in prehistoric England, a moment when the land's transformation created a new chapter in the human story. It was a time of renewal, abundance, and quiet harmony, setting the stage for the profound cultural shifts that would soon reshape the entire region. In the aftermath of the Ice Age, as England blossomed into a vast, wooded paradise, the people who lived here during the Mesolithic era became true children of the forest. Their world was a green labyrinth of towering trees, winding rivers, shimmering lakes, and dense undergrowth alive with movement. Unlike their Paleolithic ancestors, who had battled ice and scarcity, these Mesolithic communities lived in a land overflowing with resources. The forest was their home, their shelter, their pantry, and their teacher. Every sound, every scent, every shifting shadow carried meaning. To live here was to become part of the rhythm of the woods, quiet, observant, adaptable, and deeply attuned to nature's subtle languages. The Mesolithic people moved through this forest with extraordinary skill. They created light, portable shelters made from wooden frames and animal skins, allowing them to shift locations with the seasons. In summer, they camped beside lakes and rivers where fish thrived and berries ripened. In autumn, they followed the fruiting of hazelnuts, gathering them in such quantities that they could store them for months. Winter brought hunting strategies focused on red deer, boar, and smaller prey like rabbits or wild birds. Their lives followed the natural cycles of abundance, scarcity, growth, and renewal. One of their most profound innovations was the bow and arrow. This elegant tool transformed hunting into a fluid, silent art. No longer did humans need to confront animals at close range. Instead, they could move through the forest like shadows, striking prey with precision from a distance. Bows were crafted from flexible yew or elm, while arrows were tipped with tiny stone bladelets known as microliths, razor-sharp, lightweight, and deadly. This technology reflected the Mesolithic mind, efficient, creative, and adapted to the forest's complexity. Their hunting became a dance of patience and mastery. Fishing, too, became a cornerstone of daily life. Mesolithic communities crafted fish weirs, traps, hooks, and nets woven from plant fibers. They studied the movements of trout, salmon, pike, and eels, learning when rivers swelled with spawning fish or when tides filled estuaries with edible life. Along the coasts, shellfish were collected in great heaps, leaving behind the shell middens that archaeologists uncover today. The forest and water were inseparable twins, shaping both diet and culture. But their connection to the land went far deeper than survival. The Mesolithic people developed an intimate understanding of the forest's emotional and symbolic dimensions. They watched the changing shapes of clouds, the flight patterns of birds, and the shifting scents carried by the wind. They recognized the calls of animals as messages, warnings, invitations, or signs of change. Certain trees may have been seen as spiritual guardians, certain clearings as sacred spaces where generations gathered for ritual. Their world pulsed with spirit and meaning, woven into every root and river. Socially, Mesolithic bands were small but tightly knit, often consisting of extended families or several cooperating families who moved together. Their cooperation was essential for survival, but it was more than practical, it was emotional. Around evening fires, they shared stories, taught skills, and nurtured bonds that anchored them through every season. Children learned early to shape microliths, weave baskets, paddle canoes, set traps, identify edible plants, and interpret the forest's subtle clues. Knowledge passed not through written words but through practice, repetition, and the gentle corrections of elders. Trade and interaction occurred more widely than one might expect. Different bands met during migrations or at resource-rich locations such as rivers or coastlines. These encounters were opportunities to exchange materials like flint, shells, pigments, and crafted ornaments, but they were also chances to share stories, form alliances, and strengthen cultural ties. The forest, though vast, was a world of human connection. Their tools reflected a balance between practicality and artistry. Microliths were set into wooden or bone handles to create multi-purpose tools, knives, saws, spears, harpoons. They carved wooden bowls, shaped digging sticks, and created ornaments from animal teeth, shells, and smooth stones. Some objects found by archaeologists show signs of deliberate decoration, hinting at aesthetic impulses that reached beyond mere function. For the Mesolithic people, beauty and utility were intertwined. Emotionally, the Mesolithic era fostered a deep sense of belonging. This was not a world conquered by humans, it was a world lived in harmony with them. They did not attempt to dominate the forest but to participate in it. Their movements followed the land's pulse rather than resisting it. This harmony created lives that were peaceful, though not without hardship. Illness, accidents, animal attacks, and harsh winters remained threats. But compared to the brutal Ice Age, this period offered a gentler, more forgiving world. The forest itself changed because of them. As humans harvested plants, hunted animals, and built camps, they became quiet agents in shaping the environment. Small-scale burning may have been used to clear undergrowth or encourage certain plants to grow. Trails formed where humans walked repeatedly, and animals learned to follow these paths. The relationship between humans and nature became increasingly interactive, setting the foundation for larger transformations in the centuries to come. The Mesolithic era in England was a golden age of balance, a time when humans lived lightly on the land, moving with its rhythms, cherishing its gifts, and building a way of life defined by adaptability, community, and intimate knowledge of nature. They were the children of the forest, shaped by its beauty, its abundance, and its mysteries. Their world would soon change dramatically with the arrival of farming, but in this moment, the forest embraced them fully, and they thrived within its boundless green heart. As Mesolithic people moved through England's forests, rivers, and coastlines, they left behind traces of their lives, small, fragile echoes preserved in stone, bone, and earth. Unlike the later Neolithic farmers who built monuments of spectacular scale, the hunter-gatherers of this age lived lightly, leaving only subtle signatures on the land. Yet these signatures, when uncovered thousands of years later, reveal an extraordinary depth of creativity, ingenuity, and humanity. Every fragment tells a story, a tool held by ancient hands, a bone shaped with care, a hearth where families gathered. These remnants are the whispering memory of a world long forgotten. Tools were among the most enduring objects they left behind. Microliths, tiny, sharp flakes of flint, are the hallmark of the Mesolithic era. Some are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they served as the cutting edges for arrows, knives, spears, woodworking tools, and fish harpoons. Archaeologists often find hundreds of these scattered near ancient campsites, each one representing a moment of craftsmanship. To make a microlith, a skilled knapper struck precise blows on a prepared flint core, producing blades as thin as slivers of glass. These blades were then shaped, retouched, and hafted into wooden shafts using resin and sinew. Holding one today feels like touching the concentration and patience of a person who lived 8,000 years ago. Alongside stone tools, bone and antler objects offer insight into a more artistic side of Mesolithic life. Harpoons carved with delicate barbs show remarkable skill, designed not just for practicality but for efficiency and beauty. Some bones bear engraved lines or geometric patterns that may have held symbolic meaning. Perhaps these marks represented ownership, identity, or rituals tied to hunting and the cycles of nature. A few discovered artifacts display careful shaping, smooth surfaces polished by repeated handling, decorated edges hinting at aesthetic pleasure. In these carvings, we see the first hints of artistic imagination flourishing in a forested world. Ancient hearths tell another part of the story. Charcoal layers found deep in the soil mark places where families once gathered, sharing food and warmth. Around these hearths lie broken animal bones, leftovers from meals roasted over flickering flames. Archaeologists study cut marks on bones to understand butchering techniques. In many cases, these marks show a high degree of precision, clean slicing, systematic disarticulation, and efficient marrow extraction. These people were not wasteful, they used every part of the animals they hunted. Bones were tools, ornaments, and raw materials. Their meals were the heart of social life, moments when stories, laughter, and teachings passed from one generation to the next. Shell middens, great heaps of discarded shells, are among the most vivid echoes of Mesolithic coastal life. These mounds grew over years as communities harvested shellfish, leaving behind piles that can reach several meters in depth. Within these layers, archaeologists find fish bones, bird remains, nuts, seeds, and occasionally tools or ornaments lost or discarded. These middens reveal diet, seasonality, and even the social gatherings that occurred at these sites. They tell us that the Mesolithic people returned to particular places repeatedly, forming traditions tied to the land and sea. Each shell in the mound is a memory of a meal eaten in the soft light of dawn or the warm glow of a campfire. Footprints and post holes offer glimpses of structures long vanished. In some rare cases, ancient footprints preserved in mud show where individuals once walked, men, women, children, even dogs moving through wetlands or along riverbanks. Post holes, arranged in circles or arcs, reveal the outlines of wooden huts or shelters now long decayed. These structures were likely lightweight, portable, and designed for seasonal use. Yet even these temporary homes show planning and architectural understanding. They were placed near water sources, elevated for protection, or aligned with the rising sun. Each post hole marks a decision, a moment of settlement, a choice made by people navigating their world with intention. The tools and remnants found across England also show regional differences, hinting at cultural diversity among Mesolithic groups. Communities in the uplands used different materials from those living along coasts or rivers. Flint from distant quarries appears in unexpected places, suggesting trade or long-distance travel. The shapes of microliths vary from region to region, reflecting different hunting strategies or local traditions. These differences reveal that Mesolithic England was not a single, unified culture but a mosaic of interconnected groups, each developing their own identity. Burial evidence from the Mesolithic is rare but deeply meaningful. In a few places across Europe, burials from this era show bodies placed carefully, sometimes accompanied by tools, animal bones, or red ochre pigment. While England itself offers limited burial sites from this time, scattered findings suggest that the dead were not simply abandoned. Their treatment implies ritual, respect, and an awareness of mortality. When someone died, their passing resonated through the community. Perhaps the forest absorbed their memory. Perhaps stories were told to keep their presence alive in the minds of the living. Every stone blade, every carved bone, every shell mound, every faint trace preserved in the soil is an echo. These echoes connect us to a world where survival was shaped by intimate knowledge of the land, where craftsmanship expressed identity, and where daily life unfolded in quiet harmony with nature. Though the Mesolithic people left no grand monuments, their legacy endures in the subtle imprints of their hands, their decisions, and their dreams. Echoes in Stone and Bone reminds us that history is not only written in towering ruins or massive structures. Sometimes it lives in the smallest fragments, a tiny microlith, a carved tooth, a burn mark on ancient earth. These delicate remnants bridge the vast gulf of time, allowing us to feel the presence of humans who walked forests now gone, fished in rivers now changed, and lived in a world both alien and intimately familiar. As the Mesolithic world reached its peak of harmony and abundance, a slow but inevitable shift began to stir beneath the calm surface of England's forests and wetlands. The climate, always a powerful force in shaping human destiny, turned once again toward instability. Storms became more frequent, sea levels continued their relentless rise, and once stable coastlines crept inland with quiet but unstoppable force. For the people who had grown so deeply connected to the land, these changes must have felt both confusing and ominous. The world they knew, the world their ancestors had passed down through stories and memory, was beginning to unravel. At first, the changes were subtle. Summers arrived earlier or lasted longer, confusing the cycles of plants and animals. Rivers swelled unexpectedly, fed by increased rainfall and melting snow in distant mountain ranges. Lakes expanded, swallowing nearby clearings. Forests became denser in some regions and thinner in others. Certain animals shifted their migration routes, while others vanished entirely from familiar hunting grounds. Hunters returned to places their families had used for generations, only to find silence where animals once gathered. The delicate balance that had defined Mesolithic life was growing unstable. Then the storms intensified. Powerful winds swept across the landscape, bending trees, uprooting ancient pines, and tearing through dense undergrowth. Heavy rains transformed peaceful streams into violent torrents that carved new channels through the land. Coastal regions felt the greatest impact. Here, the rising seas reclaimed marshlands, flooded human camps, and washed away shell middens that had taken centuries to accumulate. Storm surges rolled inland, reshaping sand dunes, drowning lowland forests, and forcing families to abandon the shores they had long depended on for food. The psychological weight of these changes cannot be overstated. Imagine a family returning to a seasonal camp where their grandparents once lived, only to find it submerged beneath brackish water. Imagine waking to the sound of waves crashing where quiet reeds once grew, or watching a familiar forest disappear into a newly formed estuary. Such transformations must have shaken the very foundations of Mesolithic identity. Their world, once stable and reliable, seemed to be shifting unpredictably, challenging the knowledge passed down through generations. Rituals tied to certain landscapes may have lost their meaning. Sacred places may have been consumed by the sea. The storms brought fear, but also adaptation. Humans adjusted their movements, shifting camps to higher ground, exploring new inland territories, and learning to navigate wetlands formed by rising waters. They crafted lightweight canoes from hollowed logs or leather-covered frames, paddling through flooded forests and marshes where once they had walked. These boats became essential for fishing, travel, and the transportation of goods between scattered groups. With waterways expanding, the Mesolithic people developed new routes and connections, weaving networks across river systems that had once been mere trickles. Hunting strategies also changed. Animals forced inland by storms brought new opportunities but also new risks. Boar, deer, and elk adapted to the shifting environment, becoming more unpredictable in their movements. Humans had to observe these changes carefully, refining their tracking techniques and experimenting with new weapons or traps. Fishing became increasingly important as coastal waters swallowed former hunting grounds. Eels, salmon, and freshwater fish became staples of the diet, prompting innovations in net making, hook design, and fish weirs. Inland, the storms reshaped forests in dramatic ways. Fallen trees created new clearings where sunlight encouraged the growth of berries, hazelnuts, and edible plants. These openings also attracted animals, forming new hunting zones. But the destruction also created danger: unstable trees, shifting marshes, and unpredictable terrain. Humans learned to read the landscape more cautiously, adjusting routes and teaching children to recognize signs of unstable ground or flood-prone areas. Emotionally, the storms must have carried a sense of foreboding. Stories likely emerged to explain the rising waters and violent winds, tales of spirits angered, ancestors testing the living, or the world shifting into a new phase. Rituals may have developed in response, seeking to calm nature or honor forces beyond human control. Around fires, elders probably spoke of a time when the land was different, contrasting the present turmoil with memories of past abundance. These oral traditions helped communities cope, binding them together through shared meaning and collective identity. Some regions became permanently uninhabitable. Coastal valleys that once held thriving camps slowly transformed into tidal flats. Forests drowned, their trunks preserved beneath layers of silt. As these transformations spread, humans clustered more around highlands, river terraces, and inland forests. Population density increased in certain areas, leading to more frequent interactions between groups. This increased contact likely accelerated cultural exchange. New fishing techniques, tool-making styles, and storytelling traditions moved rapidly from one group to another. The storms marked more than just environmental change, they signaled the beginning of a shift in the human relationship with the land. The Mesolithic people had always adapted, but now they faced a world whose transformations were faster and more dramatic than before. The challenges pushed them toward experimentation, resilience, and deeper cooperation. They no longer lived in a stable paradise but in a dynamic landscape that demanded constant adjustment. Storms Over the New World captures the tension and transformation of this era. It was a time when humans stood at a crossroads, still children of the forest, yet increasingly aware that the world was moving towards something new. The storms were not just weather, they were the first signs of profound change, preparing the land and its people for the revolutionary shift that was about to arrive, the dawn of farming and the birth of a new way of life. As the Mesolithic people continued adapting to the shifting forests and rising waters, a quiet transformation was unfolding far beyond England's horizon, one that would soon reshape the entire landscape and the human story with it. From regions stretching across the Near East and into continental Europe, small groups of people began moving outward, carrying with them something revolutionary: the knowledge of how to grow food. These early farmers, descendants of communities who had cultivated wheat, barley, lentils, and domesticated animals for generations, slowly drifted north and west. When they finally reached the fringes of England around 6,000 years ago, their arrival marked one of the greatest cultural turning points in human history. For the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, these newcomers must have seemed both familiar and strange. They looked human, walked like humans, hunted like humans, but they also carried a different relationship with the land. Unlike the forest dwellers who moved with the seasons, these farmers settled in one place for longer periods, building more permanent houses from timber, clay, and thatch. They cleared patches of forest to plant their crops. They herded sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, managing animals in ways completely foreign to the people who had always hunted wild herds. Their way of life represented a philosophical shift: control rather than adaptation, ownership rather than mobility. The first encounters between hunter-gatherers and farmers were likely cautious, marked by curiosity rather than hostility. Trading may have begun even before farming reached British soil. Shells, flint, ornaments, and ideas moved between groups long before wheat ever touched English ground. When the first farming families arrived, they brought with them seeds preserved in leather bags, grinding stones, polished axes, pottery, and livestock capable of transforming open meadows into grazing fields. Their polished stone tools, smooth, symmetrical, and gleaming, were unlike anything Mesolithic groups had ever crafted. Such objects must have appeared almost magical, reflecting a world shaped not by wildness alone but by deliberate human design. The process of cultural contact unfolded gradually. Some hunter-gatherer groups likely observed the newcomers from a distance, watching how they built fences, tended animals, planted in lines, and stayed rooted in one location for months at a time. Others may have approached, curious about food that grew in fixed places rather than being gathered from the forest. The first taste of bread, made from ground wheat baked over fire, must have been an astonishing experience for people who had known only nuts, berries, and roasted meat. Gradually, these foods seeped into Mesolithic diets, even before farming itself took hold. But the shift was not only about food, it was about worldview. Farming demanded a new kind of thought: long-term planning, seasonal tracking tied to planting cycles, and a belief in ownership of land. For hunter-gatherers, land had always been shared, something you moved across rather than claimed. The arrival of farming challenged this ancient understanding. When farmers cleared forests to plant crops, it disrupted not only the landscape but the spiritual and cultural relationship that the Mesolithic people had with nature. Forests that had fed their families for generations were cut down. Hunting grounds shrank. Animal migrations changed. Rivers once quiet became bordered by fields. Tension likely grew as more land was cleared. Some Mesolithic groups resisted, retreating deeper into the forests, holding fast to their ancestral ways. Others blended slowly into the farming culture, marrying into farming communities or adopting livestock and small garden plots while continuing to hunt and fish. There was no single outcome. Instead, a mosaic of interactions unfolded: cooperation, curiosity, conflict, exchange, and gradual transformation. Over centuries, the two ways of life intertwined until the hunter-gatherer world began to fade. Farming families introduced pottery, shaping clay into bowls, storage jars, and cooking vessels. These objects allowed for new methods of food preparation: broths, stews, and long-stored grains, unknown to earlier peoples. The increased stability of farming meant that communities grew larger, more settled, and more socially complex. Village life began to replace seasonal camps. Tasks specialized: some tended fields, others crafted tools, others cared for animals, and others maintained hearths and pottery kilns. The rhythm of life shifted from the unpredictable song of the forest to the steady beat of planting and harvest. Livestock transformed the landscape even more dramatically. Domesticated cattle grazed in fields cleared of trees, turning dense forests into open pastures. Sheep and goats fertilized the soil and trampled paths across the land. Pigs rooted through undergrowth near early farmsteads, reshaping the ecosystem. Humans now actively engineered their environment, pushing the land toward productivity and control. The forest, once sacred and wild, began to shrink under the steady pressure of axes and fire. For the Mesolithic people who chose not to adopt farming, the world began to feel unfamiliar. Forests they had honored were disappearing. Rivers they had fished for generations were altered by nearby settlements. The sounds of cattle bells replaced the rustling of wild deer. Their identity, once so deeply intertwined with the forest, was now challenged by a new culture that valued ownership, permanence, and expansion. Yet the transformation was not one-sided. The hunter-gatherer spirit influenced the farmers as well. They adopted the knowledge of the land held by the forest people, where to find flint, where to fish, how to read the weather through the flight of birds. They learned which plants in the wild could supplement their crops. Gradually, a hybrid culture emerged, blending the old ways with the new. Strangers bearing seeds marks the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution in England, a profound shift not only in survival strategies but in worldview, identity, and humanity's relationship with nature. The arrival of farming did not simply introduce new foods, it introduced new values, new possibilities, and new tensions. It was the start of a transformation that would reshape the landscape, restructure society, and echo through every chapter of Britain's future. As farming spread across England, the land itself began to transform on a scale unseen since the retreat of the great ice sheets. The once endless forests that had sheltered the Mesolithic people were slowly carved open by polished stone axes and controlled fires. Clearings appeared like wounds in the green canopy, first small and scattered, then wide and permanent. For the first time in a million years, humans were not simply adapting to the land, they were reshaping it. The Neolithic farmers became architects of a new world, engineering fields, pastures, and settlements that left lasting marks on the landscape. Every tree felled and every furrow dug signaled humanity's growing power over nature. The heart of these new landscapes were the early farms. Families worked together to plant cereals such as wheat and barley in neat rows. These crops required attention through the seasons: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, drying, and storing. Unlike hunter-gatherers who moved with the rhythms of wild food, farmers lived by the strict schedule of agriculture. A missed season meant hunger. A failed harvest could end a community. But when the seasons cooperated, the rewards were enormous: food security, surpluses, and the ability to support larger families. This stability allowed populations to grow, and growing populations demanded even more land. Thus began a cycle of expansion that reshaped the very character of England. Animals played a central role in this transformation. Domesticated cattle were invaluable; they provided milk, meat, hides, and strength for hauling stones or dragging wooden plows. Sheep and goats grazed on newly cleared meadows, their hooves pressing the soil into firm pasture. Pigs roamed freely around settlements, rooting through forest edges and consuming scraps. The presence of these animals altered the ecosystem dramatically. Grazing prevented forests from regrowing, creating a patchwork of open fields, lightly wooded areas, and emerging farms. This human-controlled mosaic replaced the wild, unpredictable diversity of Mesolithic England. With fields established and livestock flourishing, human settlements became more permanent. Neolithic homes were sturdy structures built from timber posts, wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs. Smoke from indoor hearths drifted through small openings in the ceiling. Inside these homes, life revolved around the demands of the land: drying grain, sharpening stone tools, preparing hides, weaving baskets, shaping pottery, and preserving food. The sound of grinding stones was constant, a rhythmic reminder that farming required hours of daily labor unlike anything hunter-gatherers had known. Yet these homes also provided warmth, stability, and a sense of belonging, roots in a world that had once been perpetually shifting. As settlements grew, so did social complexity. Villages formed, sometimes clustering near rivers or fertile valleys. Families no longer lived in isolated groups. Instead, they shared resources, exchanged knowledge, and built communal structures. Tasks became specialized. Some villagers excelled in pottery making, others in flint knapping, others in herding or ritual leadership. These roles allowed culture to flourish. Traditions, stories, and customs were passed through communities that no longer migrated each season. Identity became tied to place, to land, and to ancestry rooted in the soil itself. The earth itself bore the marks of these changes. Ancient forests thinned into patchworks of farmland. Soil was tilled repeatedly, altering the nutrient balance. Wetlands were drained or actively managed. Paths and trackways emerged, shaped by repeated footsteps and animal movements. Early fences and boundary markers hinted at new concepts, land ownership and territorial division. The land was no longer shared freely, it was claimed, defended, and inherited. This shift forever changed the human relationship with nature, introducing a sense of permanence that had never existed before. But this transformation did not come without cost. Clearing forests required immense labor. Early farmers used stone axes, wooden wedges, fire, and sheer endurance to bring down towering oaks and pines. Many groups faced the dangers of falling trees, burning brush, and unpredictable weather that could ruin months of effort. Farming was risky. Pests, blights, storms, or droughts could devastate crops. The demands of settled life also created new social tensions. Conflicts arose between groups over land, grazing rights, and access to water. Settled communities were more vulnerable to disease, as larger populations living close together allowed illnesses to spread rapidly. The shift from wild foods to domesticated crops also narrowed diets, affecting overall health. Despite these challenges, the Neolithic people persevered, guided by a vision of the land shaped to their needs. Their innovations went beyond simple farming. They dug long barrows, massive communal tombs built from earth and stone. These structures required planning, cooperation, and spiritual belief. They symbolized something profound, the idea that people belonged to the land not only in life but in death. Ancestors, buried in monumental mounds, became guardians of the landscape. These barrows stood as early expressions of territorial identity and collective memory. Human energy also went into constructing causewayed enclosures, large circular areas marked by ditches and banks. These were likely gathering places for rituals, feasts, trade, and social bonding. Their construction required tens of thousands of hours of labor, revealing a level of organization unimaginable in earlier times. The people who built them had mastered the land so thoroughly that they could spare time and effort for monumental projects beyond basic survival. Spiritually, the transformation of the environment mirrored a transformation in belief. The earth, once seen as a wild provider, became a partner and a responsibility. Some areas were perhaps seen as sacred, and the act of cultivation may have been imbued with ritual. Planting seeds became a metaphor for birth, growth, and renewal. Harvest became a celebration of life's cycles. The land was no longer simply inhabited, it was nurtured, shaped, and lived with. The Earth Shapers marks the moment when humans became engineers of their destiny in England. By clearing forests, planting fields, domesticating animals, and building lasting structures, they redefined what it meant to be human. They left behind a landscape forever changed, a land where the boundaries between nature and culture began to blur, where human intention marked every hill and valley. The Neolithic people did not simply live on the land, they sculpted it, leaving an imprint that would echo across millennia. As Neolithic communities settled deeper into the landscape they had shaped, their relationship with the land evolved beyond survival. Farming gave them stability. Settlements gave them identity. But the land itself, its hills, rivers, winds, and stars, began to inspire something even greater: ritual, symbolism, and monumental architecture. This era marked the birth of some of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring structures in human history, including the first stone circles, causewayed enclosures, long barrows, and ceremonial avenues. These were not mere buildings, they were expressions of belief, memory, and cosmic understanding. They revealed a profound desire to connect earth and sky, life and death, the human world and the greater forces that shaped existence. The earliest monuments were long barrows, massive earthen mounds holding the remains of ancestors. These tombs were built with careful planning. Huge stones were dragged across miles of land, lifted into place, and buried under layers of soil. Inside the chambers, bones of the dead were arranged with reverence. These places were not isolated graves, they were communal monuments where generations returned to honor those who had shaped their world. Ancestors became eternal presences, guardians of the land and spiritual anchors for the living. The idea of ancestry deepened. People now belonged not only to a family but to a lineage rooted in the soil. But it was the stone circles that truly spoke to a new understanding of the cosmos. Thousands of years after their construction, these circles still stand as silent witnesses to a world that blended astronomy, ritual, and human unity. The earliest circles were small, arrangements of timber posts or modest stones placed in patterns aligning with the rising and setting sun. Over generations, these grew in scale and ambition. Communities cooperated to move enormous stones from distant quarries, transporting them by log rollers, sledges, and teams of coordinated laborers. Each stone's placement required precision, intention, and shared purpose. The alignment of these monuments with celestial events reveals a sophisticated knowledge of the sky. Neolithic people closely observed the sun's seasonal path, the longest day, the shortest day, and the points where shadows shifted through the year. They watched the moon's cycles and the positions of stars. This knowledge was not abstract, it was woven into agricultural life, signaling when to plant, when to harvest, and when to honor the changing seasons. Stone circles became calendars carved into the earth. When sunlight pierced through particular stones on the solstice, it marked a moment of cosmic significance, an intersection of human life and the universe. Stonehenge, though built later in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, is the most famous of these expressions. But before it existed in its iconic form, England was already dotted with ceremonial sites: Avebury's vast ring of stones, the West Kennet Long Barrow, the Cotswold tombs, the causewayed enclosures scattered across the landscape. Each site held its own meaning. Some were gathering places where communities from far regions met for feasts, rituals, and social bonding. Others may have been centers of healing, places where shamans or spiritual leaders performed ceremonies linked to the cycles of life. The land became an open-air temple, where the sky was the roof and the horizon the walls. To the people who built these monuments, every stone carried significance. The effort required was staggering: tens of thousands of hours of labor, coordination among multiple communities, and a shared belief powerful enough to motivate such monumental undertakings. These structures were not built in haste, they were crafted over generations, each addition telling a story of shifting belief. Children born during construction grew up watching their parents and grandparents shaping the stones. Rituals surrounding the work likely deepened the meaning of each phase of building. The monuments were as much cultural glue as they were spiritual structures. Ceremonial avenues and henges added further layers to these sacred landscapes. Some were designed to guide processions, leading people from rivers to circles or from settlements to burial mounds. Walking these pathways may have been a journey of transformation, from everyday life into a ritual space where people connected with ancestors, nature, and the cosmos. Torches flickering in the night, drums echoing across water, and chants rising beneath towering stones would have created experiences that shaped identity and community memory. Ritual was not an escape from life, it was the heart of it. The emotional weight of these rituals must have been immense. Imagine standing in a circle of stones during dawn on the winter solstice, knowing that generations before you had stood in the same spot, watching the same sun rise, offering the same prayers for survival and renewal. The fear of harsh winters, the hope for fertile fields, the desire to honor ancestors, all of it converged in moments where earth and sky met in perfect alignment. These rituals reminded people that they were part of something vast and eternal, bound to both the past and the future. Beyond spiritual meaning, these structures symbolized unity and power. Constructing stone monuments required cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Communities that had once remained small and scattered during the Mesolithic now connected through trade, ritual gatherings, and shared labor. The building of circles and barrows was a declaration: we are here. We belong. We remember. Monuments became markers of territory, identity, and collective purpose. They were physical representations of social cohesion in a world that had grown increasingly complex. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a deep sensitivity to nature. The people of this era did not dominate the land aggressively. They shaped it with intention, respect, and an awareness of its rhythms. Stones were placed where the earth felt significant, hilltops overlooking valleys, riverbanks offering paths of movement, natural clearings bathed in light. The Neolithic builders understood the land's emotional resonance. They felt the pulse of the earth beneath their feet and sought to bring human meaning into harmony with that ancient rhythm. Stone circles and sky rituals marks the moment when humanity turned its gaze upward, blending the practical needs of agricultural life with the deeper mysteries of existence. In these stones, in these alignments, in these ceremonial landscapes, we see the birth of culture as something monumental, literally carved into the ground. It was a time when the human heart, the land, and the sky were woven together into symbols that still stand today, whispering stories of devotion, imagination, and the eternal dance between earth and the cosmos. As England entered the later Neolithic period, its landscapes, marked by farms, stone circles, and growing settlements, became part of a broader tapestry of movement and connection stretching across Europe. This was no longer a world of isolated villages, each surviving within its own patch of land. Instead, England became a node in a vast web of trade routes, cultural exchanges, and shared ideas flowing in multiple directions. Goods, stories, beliefs, and technologies traveled along these pathways, carried by people whose horizons had expanded far beyond the boundaries of their immediate communities. These were the paths of trade and memory, routes that connected not just places, but histories and human experiences. Trade began with simple exchanges. A flint tool crafted in the chalklands of southern England might end up hundreds of kilometers away. Pieces of jet from Yorkshire were shaped into beads and traded across regions, valued for their deep black shine and symbolic power. Polished stone axes made from exceptionally hard volcanic rocks traveled astonishing distances, from the Lake District, from Wales, even from distant Ireland. These objects were not just tools, they were symbols of skill, prestige, and connection. A single axe could pass through many hands, each transfer carrying a story, a memory, a moment of human interaction. As trade networks expanded, so did the variety of goods. Seashells from distant coasts appeared inland, treasured as ornaments. Animal hides, bone tools, pigments, and pottery moved across the landscape. Each object told a story of place, of the mountain it came from, the river it crossed, the hands that shaped it. Some items carried spiritual significance, others were practical. All of them reflected the growing complexity of human relationships. Trade was no longer just about survival, it was about identity, belonging, and social bonds that stretched far beyond the home village. Along these routes, ideas traveled even more freely than goods. Farming techniques, pottery styles, burial practices, and ritual traditions moved from group to group, carried by travelers, marriage alliances, visiting shamans, or migrating families. In this era, a person could travel across great distances and still recognize familiar patterns, similar tools, similar ceremonies, similar myths whispered around fires. These shared cultural elements created a sense of connection that transcended geography. People knew they were part of something larger than their own settlement, a cultural horizon shaped by movement and exchange. The pathways themselves grew well-defined. Repeated footsteps hardened forest trails into recognizable trackways. Some paths followed riverbanks, others crossed hills, and many converged near ceremonial centers like Avebury or the later Stonehenge landscape. These were more than routes of commerce, they were routes of pilgrimage. At certain times of the year, communities journeyed great distances to gather at these sacred sites. They came carrying gifts, livestock, and offerings. They shared meals, traded goods, exchanged stories, and participated in rituals that bound them together. These gatherings were moments of unity, drawing diverse groups into a single cultural heartbeat. Memory also traveled these paths. Oral traditions, songs, myths, genealogies, moved from group to group, changing subtly as they passed along. A story born near the Welsh mountains might echo across the eastern plains in a slightly different form. A tale of an ancestor, a spirit, or a sacred place could span hundreds of kilometers. These stories were not just entertainment, they were the threads that held communities together across time and space. They carried knowledge of seasons, animals, cosmology, and ancestral deeds. They taught values, explained landscapes, and gave meaning to life's challenges. As people moved and interacted, alliances formed between groups. Marriage networks often stretched over long distances, linking families from distant regions. A woman might leave her birthplace to join her husband's community, bringing with her new skills, new traditions, and new connections. Children born from these unions inherited a blended heritage, carrying the memories of multiple landscapes. In this way, social bonds extended outward in widening circles, reinforcing trade routes and cultural unity. The landscape itself preserved these connections. Excavations reveal causewayed enclosures filled with pottery from distant regions, animal bones from far-off herds, and tools crafted from non-local stone. Waterways held remains of wooden boats that once glided across rivers connecting settlements separated by days of walking. Burial sites contain grave goods that originated far beyond local territories, burial gifts that traveled long distances before resting beside the dead. Each artifact is a testament to the journeys people made and the relationships they forged. Yet these connections did more than spread goods and ideas, they shaped identity. For the first time, communities began to think of themselves as part of a broader world. They understood that their ancestors, their rituals, and their land existed within a network of other people with similar beliefs. This sense of a shared human story was unprecedented. It allowed traditions to grow richer, technologies to advance faster, and cultural bonds to stretch further than ever before. But trade also brought change. Communities became more interdependent, relying on external goods and alliances. Competition for resources could create tension, especially in regions where demand outstripped supply. Pathways that once carried peaceful trade could also carry conflict or pressure. Yet even in these moments, the bonds of shared culture often helped mediate disputes, maintaining stability across the landscape. Paths of Trade and Memory reflects an era when England was not an isolated land but a dynamic crossroads. The people traveling these routes carried more than goods, they carried hopes, fears, dreams, and the collective memory of their communities. Their journeys shaped the identity of prehistoric England, forging connections that would influence every future chapter of its history. Through their movement, they turned the land into a living map of human experience, one where every track and river held the stories of those who walked before. As the Neolithic age drew toward its close, a new material began to transform life across Britain: copper. Its arrival marked the beginning of the Copper and Early Bronze Ages, an era defined by innovation, hierarchy, conflict, and ambition. Where stone tools had served humans for thousands of years, copper introduced a new world of possibility. Soft at first, easily shaped, and shimmering with an otherworldly glow, it felt different from anything people had touched before. To many, it must have seemed magical, a gift from the earth with a power that stone could never match. As copper spread through communities, it reshaped social structures, fueled competition, and ushered in a new kind of human, the warrior. At first, copper was rare. Only a few people knew how to extract it from or shape it into tools. These early metalworkers held knowledge that seemed almost supernatural, transforming raw stone into gleaming metal using fire and technique. Villages that possessed skilled smiths gained prestige and influence. Copper axes, knives, awls, and ornaments became symbols of status, traded along distant routes that carried goods across mountains and seas. Owning a copper blade was not just practical, it marked someone as important, connected, and powerful. The metal's softness meant it could not replace flint entirely, but its symbolism was enormous. As copper spread, so did conflict. Resources were not evenly distributed. Some regions had access to copper ore, while others did not. Communities that controlled mines or trade routes gained wealth and authority. Competition for these resources intensified. For the first time in England's long prehistory, human groups began to organize around leaders who held power, not just spiritual influence or ancestral prestige, but control over metal, land, and warriors. The seeds of hierarchy grew and intertwined with traditional community bonds, introducing new roles, new expectations, and new tensions. Weapons changed. Though stone blades remained effective, copper daggers emerged as prized possessions for young warriors. They carried these weapons at ceremonies, during feasts, or when traveling between settlements. A copper dagger signaled readiness, both to defend a community and to assert status within it. Wooden shields and early spearheads also evolved, reflecting a shift toward organized conflict. While large-scale warfare may not have been common, skirmishes, territorial disputes, and raids likely increased as groups sought to control valuable land, grazing fields, or access to trade networks. The world was becoming more competitive, more complex, and more dangerous. Alongside copper, new cultural practices took root. Burial customs changed dramatically. Earlier communal tombs gave way to individual burials, often accompanied by valuable goods, pots, ornaments, weapons, and tools. These graves reveal a society where status mattered deeply. The presence of copper artifacts in some burials but not others reflects emerging social inequality. Children and teenagers were sometimes buried with prestigious items, suggesting inherited status. In life and death, social rank now had physical expression. Despite rising competition, this era was also one of remarkable creativity. Metalworking techniques improved, pottery styles evolved, and long-distance networks strengthened. People traveled farther than ever before, forming alliances across vast regions. Amber from the Baltic, copper from Ireland or Wales, and decorative pottery from distant areas appeared in settlements across England. Cultural blending intensified, producing hybrid traditions and shared identities stretching across continents. Innovation fed ambition, and ambition fed innovation, creating a cycle that accelerated human development. The emotional experience of this age must have been intense. Young men trained to protect their communities, learning to use copper daggers, stone axes, and spears. They likely practiced hunting skills that doubled as combat training. Songs and stories about heroic ancestors spread through settlements. Around fires, elders recounted tales of border disputes, battles, alliances, and legendary warriors who defended their people. The idea of bravery became intertwined with identity, giving rise to a warrior ethos that contrasted sharply with the older, more communal spirit of the Neolithic. Women's roles also shifted. Some gained great status as craft specialists, traders, or spiritual leaders. Others took part in rituals that honored ancestors or marked seasonal cycles. Jewelry such as beads, bracelets, and pendants grew more elaborate, reflecting expanding cultural expression. Family units changed as wealth and status became more important. Those connected to metalworkers, traders, or influential leaders gained influence within the community. Rituals adapted to the new era. Stone circles and ceremonial sites continued to be used but took on new meanings tied to the emerging social order. Offerings of metal objects appeared at sacred locations, sometimes thrown into rivers or buried intentionally in pits. These acts may have been attempts to appease gods or spirits connected to the earth, acknowledging the power of metal and the dangers it brought. The rise of metal did not replace the old spiritual world, it reshaped it, introducing new myths tied to fire, transformation, and strength. As copper gradually gave way to bronze, a stronger alloy of copper and tin, the pace of change accelerated even more dramatically. But the roots of this transformation lay in the Copper Age, when people first experienced the strange new material that seemed to fuse earth and fire, strength and beauty. The Copper Age did not last long in archaeological terms, but its impact was profound. It marked the birth of hierarchy, the rise of warrior culture, and the first steps toward organized conflict. Warriors of the Copper Dawn captures a period defined by ambition, innovation, and the power struggles of a society discovering what it meant to reshape not only the land but one another. The people of this era stood at the threshold of a new world, one where metal glinted in the hands of warriors, where status was earned and displayed, and where human destiny became increasingly tied to mastery over nature's hidden treasures. As the Bronze Age dawned and England's societies grew increasingly complex, the ancient wilderness that had shaped humanity for thousands of years began to fade. The deep forests, once endless and alive with the echoes of Mesolithic footsteps, shrank as fields expanded, pastures opened, and settlements grew. Wetlands were drained, hillsides cleared, and the wild herds that had defined the earlier world slowly retreated. This was a time of transition, a moment when the natural landscape and the spiritual imagination of its people began to part ways. Yet even as the wild world withdrew, its memory lingered in stories, rituals, and the quiet dreams of those who still felt the old rhythms in their bones. By now, England was no longer the land of roaming hunter-gatherers or the early forest farmers of the Neolithic. The people of this new age lived in fortified hilltops, growing increasingly connected to networks of power, trade, and metal. Bronze swords and axes gleamed in their hands, symbols of status and control. Large, organized communities managed livestock, crops, and craftwork. Leadership roles solidified, social inequalities deepened, and the landscape bore clear signs of human control, trackways cut deep into soil, fields marked with boundary ditches, and wooden palisades surrounding settlements. The wild was no longer the master, humans were. Yet beneath this growing order, something ancient persisted. The people were still emotionally tied to nature. Their myths, symbols, and ceremonial practices remained deeply rooted in the landscapes that had defined their ancestors. Bronze Age hillforts were often built near ancient sacred sites. Rituals continued at stone circles, barrows, and rivers long considered places where the natural and spiritual worlds met. Offerings of bronze weapons, jewelry, and animal bones were placed carefully into lakes and peat bogs, acts that suggest the people still felt the presence of wild spirits watching over the land. This connection was changing, but it was not gone. The tension between wild and cultivated worlds was everywhere. Wolves still prowled in deep forests, stalking cattle along the edges of fields. Bears remained in remote woods, their presence both feared and respected. Deer continued migrating through shrinking woodland corridors, becoming symbols of a world slipping away but not yet lost. Children growing up in these communities lived between two realities: the increasingly ordered life of farming, metal, and community structure, and the mysterious wilderness just beyond the boundaries of their homes. To them, the forest was both danger and wonder, a place where stories whispered of ancient beings who had shaped the land long before humans appeared. As the Bronze Age progressed, climate shifts added new pressures. Wetter, cooler conditions returned in some regions, causing crops to fail and settlements to flood. Some communities abandoned their homes, returning to more mobile lifestyles or relocating to higher ground. Others built stronger defenses, turning settlements into fortified strongholds. These shifting conditions must have revived fears long buried since the Ice Age, memories of instability, hunger, and environmental unpredictability. The landscape was changing once more, reminding humans that control was an illusion. Nature still held power. In this era of uncertainty, rituals grew more intense. Burial mounds became more elaborate, with chambers lined with timber or stone. Grave goods, bronze weapons, pottery, beads, and crafted ornaments, reflected not only social rank but a belief that life continued beyond death. People may have felt that ancestors could still guide them through a world losing its balance. Ritual feasts grew larger, drawing groups together to reaffirm shared identity and tradition. At night, fires glowed on hilltops, flickering against ancient skies where constellations still held meaning. Under these stars, people remembered the stories of their Mesolithic and Neolithic ancestors, the forest wanderers, the earth shapers, the builders of stone. Even as their society advanced, the emotional pull of the wild world grew stronger. Myths of forest spirits, animal guardians, and ancestral beings took deeper root. The stag, the boar, and the wolf became symbols in ritual, art, and personal adornment. These animals represented qualities that humans feared losing: strength, freedom, instinct, and connection to the earth. As the real animals retreated into the shrinking wilderness, their symbolic power expanded. Humans honored them in ways that suggested a longing for the world that was disappearing, a longing for the simplicity and unity of earlier ages. The last wild dreaming was not just the fading of forests and animals, it was the fading of a worldview. The Mesolithic people who had seen the land as a living partner were now distant ancestors. The Neolithic farmers who had shaped the land with reverence were becoming legends themselves. The Bronze Age brought ambition, hierarchy, and technological brilliance, but it also brought a quiet sense of loss. The world was larger, more connected, more powerful, but it was less wild. And somewhere within human hearts, the memory of that wildness remained, stirring dreams of a time when nature and humanity lived in deeper harmony. As England moved closer to the Iron Age, the last untouched pockets of wilderness persisted like ancient echoes. Forests still whispered with winds that had blown for millennia. Rivers still carved through valleys where mammoths once walked. Hilltops still watched the shifting seasons with quiet patience. The people of this age may have sensed that these remnants were the final chapters of a much older story, a story reaching back 1,000,000 years, shaped by animal migrations, human footsteps, and the slow sculpting of the land. The last wild dreaming represents the twilight of prehistoric England's natural world. It is the moment when the wilderness that had shaped humanity from its earliest days slowly stepped back, leaving humans to carry its memory in stories, symbols, and rituals. This era marked not an end, but a transition, one where the wild world retreated into imagination, becoming a dream that future generations would seek in myths, folklore, and the quiet beauty of the few untouched places left upon the land. For 1,000,000 years, the place we now call England has been shaped, carved, inhabited, and transformed by countless generations of humans and animals, each leaving behind traces so subtle, so fragile, that only the land itself truly remembers them. This land has watched human species rise and fade. It has endured ice ages, floods, forests, and the thunder of giant beasts. It has carried the footprints of Neanderthals, the songs of Mesolithic forest children, the hopes of early farmers, and the ambitions of Bronze Age societies. Each layer of soil, each river bend, each wind-swept hill holds stories far older than memory. Now, in this final section of our journey, we stand at the end of deep prehistory to reflect on what these 1,000,000 years truly meant, how they shaped humanity, how they shaped the land, and how their echoes continue to live in every leaf, field, and stone of modern England. Imagine standing in a quiet valley at dusk, the modern world distant and faint. A soft wind stirs through tall grass. Birds circle overhead in patterns older than civilization itself. Beneath your feet, layers of earth stretch downward through time, centuries upon centuries compacted into a silent archive. Somewhere deep below lies a flint tool shaped by a Neanderthal craftsman who lived, loved, hunted, and dreamed in a world nothing like ours. Lower still, the bones of creatures long extinct rest in darkness: mammoths, straight-tusked elephants, giant deer, woolly rhinos. Deeper yet, millions of years old, lie sediments formed by ancient rivers that once flowed where entire cities now stand. When we talk about history, we speak of kings, empires, wars, inventions. But the land carries a different history, a history of time beyond time, written in soil instead of words. As humans evolved, the land changed with them. It held their fears, triumphs, rituals, and mistakes. Early Homo antecessor groups arrived timidly, testing the edge of a cold world. Their presence was brief, but the land remembers the careful footprints they left in ancient mudflats. Those footprints were preserved not because someone intended them to be, but because nature chose to hold that memory. When Neanderthals roamed this region, building shelters near rivers and hunting giant beasts, the land watched quietly. It absorbed the marks of their tools, the charcoal of their campfires, the bones they left behind. Though their voices vanished tens of thousands of years ago, their traces whisper from the earth to those who know how to listen. When Homo sapiens finally entered England, carrying imagination like a torch through the darkness, the land responded to their creativity. They carved flint with unprecedented skill. They painted their bodies, crafted ornaments, and shaped tools that could reach prey from a distance. The land remembers their innovation in the countless flint flakes buried across hillsides, in the ashes of hearths hidden beneath layers of sediment, and in the bones of animals they hunted and honored. These early humans saw the land not just as a resource but as a presence, something alive, something that shaped their stories and inspired their rituals. Their connection to nature was intimate and emotional, far deeper than modern language can express. As the Ice Age returned in violent waves, the land remembered the cold. It recorded the advance of glaciers and the scars they carved into bedrock. It preserved pollen from tundra plants that once blanketed the plains. It held fossilized footprints of humans fleeing southward as the world froze around them. But it also remembered the warmth that followed, the forests that spread like great green rivers, the return of animals, the laughter of Mesolithic families who navigated the woods with silent confidence. These people lived lightly on the land, but even their lightness left echoes: a discarded microlith here, a fishbone there, a post hole revealing where a shelter once stood. Doggerland, the great landmass that once connected England to Europe, still exists in the land's memory, despite being swallowed by the sea. Beneath the North Sea, layers of peat, silt, and sand hold the remnants of ancient forests, rivers, and human settlements lost millennia ago. The land remembers Doggerland even if humans almost forgot it. Every artifact dredged up from the seabed, an antler harpoon, a shaped flint tool, the jawbone of an ancient hunter, reminds us that the land carries memories even beneath water. The sea may cover Doggerland's surface, but it cannot erase the stories etched into its drowned soil. As the Neolithic dawned and farming spread, the land felt a new kind of touch. Humans began to sculpt it intentionally, clearing forests, digging ditches, erecting wooden structures that linked homes into communities. The earth remembers these changes in its altered soil layers, in the grain imprints left in pottery fragments, in the pollen records showing forests shrinking under the cut of polished axes. It remembers the first cattle driven across meadows, the first wheat grown in English soil, the first boundary lines drawn by human hands. These memories are not written in ruins, but in the subtle signatures of environmental transformation. Then came the builders of monuments, those who shaped England's spiritual landscape with stones and earth. Long barrows, causewayed enclosures, and stone circles rose from the ground like expressions of human longing, creativity, and cosmic awareness. The land remembers the labor of thousands who hauled massive stones for miles, the rituals performed under rising moons, the chants that echoed across open plains during solstice gatherings. These monuments were not built to dominate nature but to converse with it, to align with the sun, the stars, the ancestors, and the hills. Today, Stonehenge and Avebury stand as the most visible memories of those rituals, but hundreds of lesser-known sites across the country hold equally deep stories. The land stores them all. The Bronze Age added new layers of memory, layers shaped by hierarchy, metalworking, and conflict. The soil remembers the ash of burnt settlements, the footprints of warriors marching across fields, the graves where bronze daggers were placed in the hands of the dead. It remembers the clearing of more forests to build hill forts, the introduction of new crops and livestock, the rise of social inequality. Yet alongside these changes, the land continues to remember the enduring spiritual connection humans maintained with natural forces. Offerings placed in rivers or bogs, the bones of sacrificed animals, the ornaments lost during rituals, all remain preserved as quiet testimonies to a world where nature and the supernatural intertwined. But the most profound memory the land holds is the memory of transformation, the million-year arc in which humans changed from small, vulnerable mammals into beings capable of reshaping the environment, imagining rituals aligned with the heavens, and building societies with complex identities. The land remembers this not as a series of events but as a continuum of presence. Each generation left something behind, a tool, a bone, a structure, a footprint, a piece of themselves woven into the earth's deep layers. And the land carried these pieces forward through time, keeping them safe until we uncovered them again. Today, when archaeologists kneel in muddy trenches or divers search the seafloor, they are not discovering the past, they are listening to the land's memory. They are reading stories written in silent layers, learning from the marks left by people who never imagined their lives would be studied millennia later. Every excavation is a conversation between the living and the long-departed. Every discovery is a reminder that humans have always been storytellers, even when they never wrote a word. But the land does not only remember the past, it invites us to reflect on the future. When we walk through ancient forests that once sheltered Mesolithic hunters, or stand before a stone circle aligned to the solstice, or gaze across rolling hills once shaped by Neolithic farmers, we participate in a dialogue that has endured for countless generations. We become part of the memory. Every footprint we leave on a moor, every thought we have while standing on an ancient burial mound, every moment of reflection in a prehistoric landscape adds a new layer to the ongoing story. In this way, England's prehistoric past is not lost, it is alive. It lives in the contours of the land, the shape of valleys, the positions of ancient stones, the quiet flow of rivers that have run since the last ice age. It lives in the DNA of modern people, carrying fragments of Neanderthal ancestors and memories of hunter-gatherers who once crossed Doggerland's plains. It lives in the wild animals that still roam forests, in the seasonal rhythms that continue unchanged, and in the rituals we still perform, celebrations of solstices, harvests, and timeless natural cycles. The final truth is this: the land remembers not because it tries to, but because everything humans have ever done becomes part of it. The soil absorbs our presence, our actions, our hopes and fears. Long after we are gone, it will continue to hold those memories, storing them in layers waiting to be rediscovered. The land is not just a witness to history, it is the keeper of it. And so, as our journey through a million years of England comes to an end, we stand in the present with a deeper awareness of the footsteps behind us. We understand that the landscapes we see today are not merely scenery, they are living archives of human perseverance, adaptation, imagination, and transformation. We are not separate from this story. We are its newest chapter. The land remembers everything. And, if we listen closely, it teaches us that we, too, are part of a story far older and far greater than ourselves.